Every region in the Pokemon world has a place where the map simply ends without explanation. Some questions were written into the games on purpose, seeded carefully so that wonder would outlast the credits. Others were never meant to be answered, existing only as a kind of breathing space in the edges of a world still being discovered. Tonight, we move gently through those open spaces, the mysteries that researchers and trainers alike have turned over for decades without resolution. If this kind of quiet exploration is something you find yourself returning to, consider subscribing before we begin and let the first mystery settle gently around you. There is a single entry in the oldest Pokédex that describes a creature so small and pale it is almost translucent in the light. Mew is said to carry the genetic composition of every Pokémon that has ever lived on Earth, a claim so extraordinary that it tends to be repeated and then quietly passed over, as if its full weight is too difficult to hold for very long. The idea that one creature could contain within its cells the entire biological heritage of a world is not treated as a curiosity in the Pokemon games. It is treated as fact. Scientists who appear briefly in the Johto region confirm that Mew's DNA serves as a kind of living archive, a record of all forms life has taken in this world, preserved and carried forward through time without any particular care for how strange that makes Mew's existence. What remains unresolved is what Mew's existence actually means for everything that came after it. If every Pokémon evolved from a common genetic origin found in Mew, then the relationship between a Magikarp and a Mewtwo is far closer than it appears. They share not just a world but an ancestor, a tiny, playful, curious creature that seems entirely unaware of its own significance. Mew was discovered on a physical level before its role in the larger story was understood. Field reports from the Guyana expedition that preceded the events of the first games describe a creature glimpsed only briefly in jungle terrain, leaving behind traces that took years to analyze. The discovery was so disruptive to existing models of Pokémon biology that the research team chose to keep their findings classified for a period before the information became impossible to contain. The decision to study Mew in a laboratory setting led directly to one of the most consequential and troubling events in Pokémon history. Scientists working under powerful interests extracted a single eyelash and used the genetic material within it to begin a cloning project unlike anything that had been attempted before. The creature that emerged from that project would change everything, and if you find yourself wanting to return to these kinds of stories, let the channel know before we move any deeper. What the scientists created was not simply a copy of Mew, but something that had never existed before. Mewtwo was engineered to be the most powerful Pokémon in the world, and the notes from the laboratory make clear that its creators succeeded in that goal while failing entirely to understand what they were actually building. They were not creating a tool. They were creating a being, one that would eventually look back at its origins and find them impossible to accept. Mewtwo's early life inside the laboratory is documented in journal entries recovered from the ruins of the facility on Cinnabar Island. The entries describe a creature that asked questions from the moment it became aware, questions about why it existed and what it was meant to become. The scientists did not answer those questions. Their research notes focused entirely on measurements, on power output, on the stability of the genetic modifications. The emotional reality of what they had created was simply not part of the study. The fire that destroyed the Cinnabar laboratory is not formally attributed to Mewtwo in any official government document. But the timing of the incident, occurring in the same period during which Mewtwo broke free of its containment and disappeared, suggests a connection that most researchers choose not to examine directly. What remains is a burned building, a set of incomplete journals, and a Pokémon that left the island with no particular direction, and a very particular kind of grief. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at what Mewtwo did in the years between its escape and its eventual encounters with trainers. The anime and the game canon diverge on some specifics, but both agree that Mewtwo did not simply vanish. It found a location, established something resembling a purpose, and began to develop a philosophy about the nature of created beings and the responsibility of those who create them. These are not thoughts that scientists predicted when they began their research. They emerged because something genuinely new had come into existence. The question of what Mew makes of Mewtwo is one that the Pokémon world has never formally addressed. Mew appears in various contexts across the games and the anime, but never in a scene that directly confronts the relationship between an origin and its most extreme artificial extension. Whether Mew is aware of Mewtwo's existence, or whether the two have ever occupied the same space at the same time, remains completely unknown. The silence on that question is one of the more interesting absences in a story full of things that are simply never said. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, it becomes clear that the mystery surrounding Mew is not just biological, but philosophical. The games treat Mew as a kind of living before the beginning, a creature that predates the categories we use to understand the world. It is neither legendary nor ordinary in the way those terms are used for other Pokémon. It is something else, something that the Pokédex acknowledges but cannot quite describe. And that particular kind of mystery, the kind that resists the resolution of a simple answer, is one of the most enduring things the Pokémon world has ever created. There is a cave in the Johto region where the walls speak, not in any language that translators have fully deciphered, but in shapes that recur across ruins separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of years. The Unown were discovered in the ruins of Alph before their significance was properly understood, and in some ways they remain not fully understood even now, despite decades of study. Each individual Unown resembles a character from an ancient alphabet. There are 26 standard forms and 2 additional variants, and the relationship between these shapes and the writing system they echo has never been satisfactorily explained. Did human writing develop from early contact with Unown, or did Unown evolve their forms in response to human writing? Neither explanation sits cleanly with the available evidence, and researchers who specialize in the question tend to grow quiet when pressed for a definitive answer. What the research agrees on is that individual Unown are extremely weak. A single specimen has almost no capacity for independent thought or complex action. It exists at the margins of what most trainers would consider worth catching, a flat, eye-shaped creature that hovers and does very little on its own. The power that Unown are capable of when they gather in large numbers is a different matter entirely. The events documented in what became known as the Unown incident in the Johto region involved a child's wishes intersecting with the collective power of thousands of Unown gathered beneath the earth. The creatures appeared to be responding not to commands but to deep emotional states, to the kind of longing that is too specific and too urgent to simply pass through the air without consequence. A city was transformed overnight into a crystalline structure that cut it off from the rest of the region, and the mechanism behind that transformation was a small girl's need for her sick mother to be well. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at what happened after the crisis was resolved. The Unown return to their ruins, to the walls where they wait in formations that suggest purpose without revealing what that purpose is. The town gradually returned to normal. The researchers who had been studying the ruins of Alph continued their work with, if anything, less certainty than before. And the child at the center of the incident grew up in a world that had briefly shown her what the Pokémon universe could do when it chose to respond to human need with something enormous and uncanny. The Sinnoh region added another layer to the unknown mystery that the Johto research had not anticipated. Ancient tablets in the Canalev City Library describe the Unown as the alphabet of the universe, which is a phrase that sounds poetic until one considers it seriously. If Unown are letters, then the questions that follow are about what sentences they form, who reads them, and what happens when those sentences describe something that has not yet occurred. The connection between Unown and the creation myth of the Sinnoh region is implicit in the library texts rather than direct. The being described as having shaped the world into existence operates through a language of thought and will that some scholars believe Unown represent in physical form. This interpretation has not been confirmed by any research. but it has also never been ruled out. And in the Pokemon world, that kind of persistent ambiguity tends to mean something. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the unknown become less like a straightforward mystery and more like a question about what language is and what it can do when it exists independently of any speaker. The ruins where they live are full of text that nobody has fully translated. The symbols on the walls of Alph and the ancient shrines of Sinnoh and the ruins scattered through Kalos all suggest a system of meaning that predates recorded history. And at the center of that system, hovering silently in the dark, are small flat creatures that look like letters and behave like something the dictionary has not yet found a word for. The highest point in the Sinnoh region is a mountain that most trainers never visit. At its summit, there is an altar so old the stone has forgotten what it was made for. Somewhere behind the walls of that mountain, in a dimension that sits adjacent to the one where cities and roots and gyms exist, there is a hall. And in that hall, if one carries certain items and performs certain actions that were once considered sacred, something arrives that the Pokédex describes simply as the original one. Arceus is listed in the National Index with the number 493. The number means very little except that the being it describes was cataloged last, added to the end of a list that was already complete. The number does not account for the fact that Arceus is described as having shaped the universe. These two things exist side by side in the Pokémon world, a creature with a catalog number and a myth about it predating all existence. And neither fact seems to diminish the other. The creation story preserved in the Sinnoh library tablets describes a state of complete nothing, not darkness, but an absence of anything at all, from which a single egg emerged. That egg hatched, and the creature inside it expanded the nothing into something, creating time and space and matter through actions that the tablets do not describe in mechanical terms, but in terms of will and intention, and the particular quality of attention that a being pays to the work it is doing. What the tablets do not explain, and what the games themselves are careful not to address, is what Arceus intended. The universe was created, and then Arceus created helpers, the beings associated with time and space, and antimatter, the beings associated with emotion and knowledge and will. But whether the creation of the Pokémon world was a purposeful act with a specific goal, or something more like an experiment, a thing done because it could be done, remains completely open. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the only known instance of a human encountering Arceus directly. The trainer who reached that hall and faced the original one reported afterward that the encounter had changed something in how they understood the relationship between themselves and the world around them. This kind of testimony is difficult to include in a scientific report, but it appears in personal journals and in the accounts that passed between communities of trainers who took the old myths seriously. The attempt by a researcher named Cyrus to use the powers of legendary Pokémon to collapse and rebuild the universe according to his own design gives the Arceus myth an unexpected practical dimension. Cyrus understood Arceus's role in creation well enough to believe that controlling the Lake Guardians and the temporal and spatial legendaries would allow him to reach a state of authority over existence itself. He failed, and his plan collapsed in the Distortion World, but the attempt itself suggests that the creation myth is not simply a story. It is a set of operating instructions for a universe that is still, in some sense, running. The question of what Arceus actually wants, whether it monitors the world it created, or whether creation was a completed act that left it free to exist without continued investment, is one that the games have approached only tangentially. There are moments in the Pokémon world that seem to suggest observation, small events that align with a precision too elegant to be coincidence. And there are long stretches where the evidence suggests that Arceus left the world to proceed on its own terms. Both of these possibilities are troubling in different ways, and neither one resolves comfortably. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the mystery of Arceus is not really about a single creature. It is about the relationship between origin and consequence, between the act of making something and the responsibility that follows from that act. The Pokémon world was made, and it is full of beauty and violence and small kindnesses and enormous suffering. Whether any of that was intended, and whether anything is watching and deciding what to do about it, remains unknown in a way that the word unknown does not quite capture. In 3 lakes spread across the Sinnoh region, each one still and cold and surrounded by trees that have been standing long enough to have opinions about the weather. There are 3 beings that have lived beneath the water for longer than the towns beside those lakes have existed. Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf are categorized as the Lake Trio, but that categorization does not begin to describe what they actually represent. Uxie is the being of knowledge, described in the ancient texts as the entity that gave intelligence to living creatures. Before Uxie, according to those texts, the world was full of life that could not reflect on itself. Animals existed and moved and survived without the capacity to step back from their survival and examine it. Uxie changed that. Its eyes, which are always closed, because to open them fully is to erase the memory of whoever looks, are described as the origin of the ability to understand. Mesprit is the being of emotion, the entity that gave living creatures the capacity to feel. The relationship between knowledge and emotion in the context of the Lake Trio is not one of simple hierarchy. Knowledge did not come first, and emotion follow later as a complication. The texts suggest that both came at once, that understanding and feeling were given together as part of a single gift that could not be split into components without losing something essential. Azelf is the being of willpower, and its role is perhaps the most quietly strange of the 3. Will is distinct from knowledge and from emotion in that it is about the capacity to act in response to knowing and feeling. A being with knowledge and emotion, but without will, would understand what it felt and feel what it understood, but would not move. Azelf is what allows the movement. It is the connection between interior experience and the physical world, the hinge point between thought and action. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at where these 3 beings choose to live. They are in lakes, in water, in the substance that reflects the sky back to itself. The choice of habitat is not incidental in the Pokémon world, where the relationship between a creature's nature and its environment tends to be meaningful. The Lake Trio lives in reflection, in places where looking down reveals the sky, where the boundary between what is above and what is below becomes uncertain. It is a subtle detail, but it fits. The events of the Sinnoh crisis brought the Lake Trio out of their stillness and into conflict for the first time in the documented record. Cyrus's organization captured all 3, using technology designed to extract and weaponize the emotional and cognitive and volitional energies these beings represented. The idea that willpower and knowledge and emotion could be detached from their sources and used as raw material for a universe-reshaping project speaks to a particular kind of thinking about consciousness. One that the games present as the defining flaw in a man who understood the world's structure but misunderstood entirely what it was for. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the Lake Trio represents something that the Pokémon world rarely makes explicit: the idea that the capacities we consider most fundamentally our own were given. Intelligence is not inherent. Emotion is not inherent. Will is not inherent. They were gifts from 3 beings who live in cold northern lakes and have been there since before memory began. The implications of that idea for how humans and Pokémon understand themselves and each other are, if followed honestly, quite vertiginous. There is a world that exists alongside the Pokémon world without touching it, a place of inverted geography where waterfalls flow upward, and the laws that govern physics are suggestions rather than rules. The Distortion World has appeared in only 1 game, but its existence was implied in the mythology of the Sinnoh region long before it was visually rendered, described in the ancient texts as the place of antimatter, the reverse of everything that exists. Giratina was sent to the Distortion World, though the accounts disagree on who made that decision and whether the word sent is accurate. Some texts suggest it was condemned for violent behavior in the period before the world was fully formed, before consequence and intention had been clearly established as concepts. Others frame the separation differently, describing the distortion world not as a prison, but as a domain, a place that requires a guardian as much as any other dimension requires one. The ambiguity about whether Giratina was punished or assigned is not a small distinction. It changes the fundamental nature of the creature's situation, and it changes what it means that Giratina occasionally returns to the ordinary world through tears in the fabric that separates the dimensions. A creature that was punished and escaping is one thing. A creature that was assigned and checking on its charges is something quite different. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the geography of the distortion world as it presents itself to the trainer who enters it. The world is not random. It has structure, even if that structure is unfamiliar. There are platforms and pathways and places where the environment changes in response to movement. The suggestion is that this is an organized place, maintained by something that understands it, shaped by the intelligence of its long-term occupant. Giratina's altered form, which is the form it takes when it exists in the ordinary world, is constrained compared to its origin form, which expresses its full shape only in the distortion world. This detail suggests that the distortion world is not simply where Giratina is kept, but where it is complete, a dimension that corresponds to the creature's actual nature in the way that a deep ocean corresponds to a creature that is evolved to live in total darkness and enormous pressure. The question of what would happen if the boundary between the two worlds were to collapse is one that the ancient texts raise without answering. The mythology describes the balance between matter and antimatter as the condition under which the world can exist at all. If that requirement ceased to be met, the texts do not describe what would follow, and the silence on the question feels deliberate in a way that silence rarely feels. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, Giratina becomes less a single mystery and more a window into the Pokémon world's understanding of what it means for something to exist at all. The distortion world is not a place where nothing is real. It is a place where everything is real in the opposite direction, a mirror that shows not your face, but your antimatter equivalent. That a creature lives there, maintains it, and occasionally emerges from it to observe the world it was separated from is, if held at the right angle, one of the most quietly extraordinary things in the entire history of the Pokémon universe. We are roughly halfway through this quiet journey, and if you have found yourself returning to this kind of exploration more than once, the subscribe button is still waiting, unhurried, ready whenever you are. The island of New Moon Island is not listed on most maps of the Sinnoh region. It sits in the water with the particular self-effacing quality of places that prefer not to be noticed, and the only Pokémon known to live there is one that the Lake Trio and the Creation Legends have very little to say about directly. Darkrai is categorized as a nightmare Pokémon, but the word nightmare fails to capture what the available evidence suggests about what this creature actually is. What Darkrai does is give nightmares to whatever living being is nearby when it is present. This appears to be involuntary. The accounts from communities near New Moon Island describe a creature that does not choose to terrify. It simply does, the way a light in a dark room illuminates without choosing what it reveals. The nightmare a Darkrai gives is not a random experience. Those who have survived encounters report that the nightmares have a coherence and a specificity that ordinary bad dreams do not have. They are not simply frightening. They are precisely frightening, shaped around the fears most particular to the individual experiencing them. This detail has led some researchers to argue that Darkrai's nightmare effect requires some form of reading, some access to the interior experience of the creature it is affecting, which raises questions about what kind of awareness is required for that kind of precision. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the relationship between Darkrai and Cresselia. The two are described as natural opposites, with Cresselia's power to create beautiful dreams standing in contrast to Darkrai's nightmare-inducing presence. Darkrai is described as lonely in the texts, as a creature that exists on an island because it cannot safely be near other living things, not because it is malevolent, but because its nature makes proximity harmful. What the Darkrai mystery reveals about the Pokémon world is a category of creature that exists not in opposition to goodness, but in an uncomfortable relationship with it. Darkrai cannot be good in the way that most creatures can be good, by choosing kindness and avoiding harm. Its nature prevents that particular form of goodness. What it can choose is isolation, the decision to live on an island where its presence cannot reach anyone who has not sought it out. This is a form of care, muted and cold, and structured around absence rather than warmth, but recognizable as something that intends not to hurt. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, Darkrai raises a question that the Pokémon world does not answer. What does it mean to be good when your nature makes it impossible to act well in any normal way? The creature on New Moon Island chose the island. That choice is not meaningless. It is, in its quiet way, one of the more morally serious things the Pokémon universe has ever described. Time travel in the Pokémon world is not the dramatic rupturing of space that science fiction tends to describe. It is a gentle thing associated with a small green creature that looks like something between a fairy and a plant. A creature that tends to appear in forests and whose presence is considered an omen of good fortune by communities that have known about it for long enough to develop traditions around its occasional visits. Celebi has been traveling through time for longer than any record documents, arriving in different eras with what appears to be curiosity rather than purpose, staying for a while and then moving on. The paradoxes that time travel implies for the Pokémon world are handled in different ways by different pieces of the canon. The games tend to treat time travel as something that happened and left consequences, without dwelling on the logical questions those consequences raise. The anime explored a particular case in which Celebi was responsible for carrying a trainer from the present into the past, with effects that rippled forward in ways neither the trainer nor Celebi had anticipated. What the records make clear is that Celebi does not appear to be in control of its own movement through time in any precise way. It does not seem to choose specific moments or specific outcomes. It appears in the past and the future in the way that a leaf appears in different places as it moves downstream, carried by something that has its own momentum rather than directing the leaf's specific path. This randomness in an entity associated with luck and with the health of forests suggests that the Pokémon world's relationship with time is organic rather than mechanical. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at what happens to forests where Celebi has spent time. The trees in those areas show unusual patterns of growth, root systems that interact with each other in ways that biologists find difficult to explain using standard models of plant communication. The forest ecosystem appears to benefit from Celebi's presence in ways that are measurable long after Celebi itself has moved on. Whether this is a deliberate gift or a side effect of a time-traveling creature's passage through a physical environment is unknown. The Ilex Forest in the Johto region is the location most consistently associated with Celebi in the documented record. Local traditions describe a shrine maintained in that forest for longer than the surrounding towns have existed, a structure built not to worship Celebi, but to welcome it, to maintain a space where the creature could be comfortable if it chose to appear. The maintenance of that shrine, through generations, through changing communities and changing understandings of what Celebi actually is, speaks to a kind of faith that is specifically about leaving room for what cannot be fully understood. The question of whether Celebi experiences time the way other beings do, whether it has memories that accumulate in some order, or whether past and future are equally present to it, has no answer in the available evidence. If Celebi's experience of time is not sequential, then the concept of growing older does not apply to it. Both of the possibilities this implies are from the perspective of a species that experiences time in a single direction. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, Celebi represents a kind of mystery that is not about darkness or danger, but about the structure of time itself and what it means to move freely within something that everyone else experiences as a constraint. The forests it visits are healthier for its presence. The communities that know about it describe it with affection. The paradoxes it implies are real and unresolved, and the small green creature itself continues to appear and disappear across eras with a gentleness that suggests it is not troubled by any of the questions it raises in the minds of those who know enough to ask them. In the Ekritique city of the Johto region, there are two towers. One stands, one burned. The tower that stands, the Bell Tower, was home to a creature that the city's communities describe as the guardian of the sky. The tower that burned, the Brass Tower, was home to three creatures before the fire, and it was also the place where those three creatures died and were brought back in the forms that trainers now encounter in the wild. The fire that destroyed the Brass Tower occurred approximately 150 years before the events of the Johto games, and the cause of the fire is one of those historical details that the available record does not resolve cleanly. Lightning is the most commonly cited explanation, a natural event that the building was not able to withstand, but the specificity of the consequences. Three Pokémon dying in the fire and being revived by the Guardian of the Sky watching from the intact tower suggests that the event carried significance beyond the ordinary randomness of a building struck by lightning. What the Guardian of the Sky saw from the bell tower, and what it decided in the moment when it chose to revive the three Pokémon who had died in the fire, is information that no text preserves directly. The decision to revive them, in the forms of Raikou, Entei, and Suicune, carrying within them the characteristics of the lightning and fire and water that were present in the circumstances of their deaths, was a decision made by a being whose motives are never explained in any document that has survived. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at how the three beasts behave in the years after their revival. They do not return to the tower. They do not seem to seek out the guardian who revived them. They wander through the Johto region in patterns that appear to be related to the natural phenomena they now embody: Raikou following storms, Entei near volcanic activity, Suicune moving through landscapes where water flows. They were given life, and then seemed to interpret that gift as an invitation to inhabit the world rather than to return to a home. The tower that burned has not been rebuilt. Its ruins stand in Ekritique City as a monument to an event that the city has processed into civic identity without entirely resolving the grief that underlies it. The community that lives beside these ruins has built its culture around the understanding that something can be lost and then return in a different form, that the three creatures wandering the Johto region are proof that loss is not always permanent. Whether that understanding is consolation or justification for not fully acknowledging what was lost is a question the ruins raise quietly every time someone notices them. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the burned tower and the three beasts represent one of the Pokémon world's clearest statements about transformation and the specific kind of second life that comes from being revived under extraordinary circumstances. The creatures that wander Johto now are not what they were before the fire. They carry new natures shaped by the manner of their dying. What they remember of their previous existence, whether they experience themselves as continuous with what they were before or as entirely new, is something the world has watched without asking. 3,000 years before the events of the games set in the Kalos region, there was a war. The details of that war, who fought it, what was at stake, how long it lasted, are preserved only in fragments, in stories that communities in Kalos tell about an era they call ancient, with a particular weight that distinguishes it from the merely old. What is known with some certainty is that the war involved Pokémon used as weapons, that it lasted long enough to reshape the landscape, and that it ended because of something that was built. A man named AZ had a Pokémon that was sent to fight in the war and did not return. AZ recovered the remains of that Pokémon. He then built something of unprecedented scale, a weapon so large that its physical structure altered the geography of the region, using the energy of the Pokémon's life force as the mechanism by which it operated. The weapon worked. The war ended, But the ending was not clean, and Aze's grief was not resolved by it. The weapon did not simply stop the fighting. It destroyed on a scale that made everything that had preceded it look like the beginning of a different kind of disaster, rather than the end of the original one. The life energy that had powered the weapon was spent, which meant that the Pokémon could not be recovered and revived in the way that AZ had originally intended, and the weapon's use left behind a change in AZ himself. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at what the weapon's use meant for AZ's relationship with time. The mechanism of the ultimate weapon involved transforming life energy on an enormous scale, and the discharge of that energy appears to have affected the operator of the weapon as well as its targets. AZ survived 3,000 years between the end of the war and the events of the Kalos games. He remembered everything. He aged during that time in ways that were gradual rather than normal. He was recognizably himself throughout, but he was also something that no other human has ever been: continuous. The Pokémon that AZ had loved and lost eventually found its way back to him through a series of events that the Kalos game describes deliberately, incompletely. It spent 3,000 years wandering, unable to forgive and unable entirely to forget, before the moment when forgiveness became possible. The reunion between AZ and his Pokémon at the end of a game about championships and beauty and the nature of evolution is one of the moments in the Pokémon series that has very little to do with gameplay and everything to do with what it means to carry something for too long and finally be able to put it down. The ultimate weapon's physical remains are still present in Kalos during the events of the games, a structure visible in the landscape that most characters treat as simply part of the geography. The people of Kalos have decided, generations ago, that the thing to do with enormous historical catastrophe is to let it become scenery rather than to continue engaging with it actively. Whether that decision represents peace or avoidance is not a question the games answer. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the story of AZ is one of the Pokémon world's clearest examinations of what grief can do when it is carried long enough. Not the grief of a season or a year, but of an era. The particular weight of a loss that you built the end of a war to address and then found you had made worse. 3,000 years of walking through a world that continued without you, waiting for something you were not sure would ever return, is a mystery not about magic or mythology, but about what love costs when the circumstances that surround it become extraordinary. There are stones in the Pokémon world that are not ordinary stones, that carry within their crystalline structure an energy that responds to the bond between a trainer and a Pokémon in a way that temporarily transforms the Pokémon into something beyond what it was born as. Mega Evolution was introduced to the world through the games set in the Kalos region, but the evidence preserved in ruins and in the mountain shrines of Hoenn suggests that the phenomenon is far older than the era in which it was formally documented. The origin of the Keystones and the Megastones, the paired items required for Mega Evolution to occur, is one of the genuinely unresolved questions in Pokémon biology. The stones respond to emotional states, specifically to the intensity and clarity of the connection between a specific trainer and a specific Pokémon. No mechanical explanation for how crystalline matter could develop sensitivity to emotional conditions has been offered, and the research community's response has been largely to document the effect without proposing a mechanism. The Draconid people of the Hoenn region have the oldest recorded knowledge of Mega Evolution, preserved in a tradition that predates the naming of the phenomenon by many generations. Their accounts describe the energy involved not as something inside the stones, but as something that the stones allow through them, a connection to a reservoir of power associated with the meteor that made first contact with the Pokémon world in the ancient past. The meteor's energy, in this account, was absorbed into the earth and concentrated in specific geological formations that eventually became the megastones in their current form. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the emotional requirements for Mega Evolution to function. The bond required is not simply affection. It is something more specific, a mutual recognition of shared purpose, an understanding between trainer and Pokémon that operates below the level of language and strategy. This requirement means that Mega Evolution cannot be forced. It is not a technique that can be learned and applied regardless of the relationship between the participants. It is an expression of what a relationship already is. The Mega Evolved forms that various Pokémon take show changes that go beyond simple power increases. The physical appearance shifts in ways that suggest not a temporary augmentation, but a brief manifestation of something that was already present in potential, a form that the Pokémon could occupy if the conditions were exactly right. What those conditions are, and why the conditions of the ancient world allowed them to occur more frequently than the conditions of the modern world, is another layer of the mystery that the Draconid records hint at, without fully explaining. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, Mega Evolution is a mystery that sits at the intersection of geology, biology, emotion, and mythology in a way that no single discipline can fully address. The stones are real and measurable. Their effects are documented. The relationship between those effects and the emotional state of the people and Pokémon involved is also observable and repeatable. But the explanation that connects all of these observable things into a coherent account of what is actually happening remains genuinely open. In the underground passages that run beneath the Kalos and Alola regions, there are creatures so small that they are easy to miss entirely. Zygarde cells have no awareness on their own. They exist in isolation without thought or will or the capacity to act toward any particular end. The mystery of Zygarde is not in any single form, but in what those cells become when they begin to collect. When the threshold of aggregation crosses a critical point, and something that functions as a coordinating intelligence begins to emerge from the accumulated mass of individually inert components. At 10% of its cells, Zygarde takes the form associated with a dog, a creature built for speed and aggressive defense, capable of movement and decision-making that individual cells could not support. At 50%, the form that resembles a serpent appears, a body of considerable scale and the capacity for complex interaction with the environment. At full assembly, 100%, a form emerges that the mythology of both Kalos and Alola describe in language usually reserved for catastrophe, a being that the traditions say will express itself fully only when the ecosystem is in genuine crisis. The threshold for what counts as genuine crisis is not specified anywhere in the available documentation. The traditions describe it obliquely, using language about balance and the proper relationship between living things and the world they inhabit. What that means in practical terms, what would have to occur in the Pokémon world for Zygarde to determine that it needed to assemble fully and act, is not known. The full form has not been observed in recent history. The traditions that describe it are old enough that their accuracy is uncertain. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at how Zygarde's system of cells and cores distributes awareness. The cores, which are the components that carry something like consciousness and coordinating intelligence, are few in number compared to the cells. Each core can communicate with cells and with other cores, creating a distributed network of awareness that operates across a geographic range far larger than any individual creature could monitor. Zygarde, in its distributed state, is simultaneously present across an enormous area, attending to conditions in multiple locations without being physically concentrated in any one of them. This mode of existence, spread across the earth in thousands of small, individually unconscious fragments that collectively maintain awareness of an entire ecosystem, is unlike anything else documented in the Pokémon world. Other legendary Pokémon are powerful in concentrated forms. Their power is intense and present in one place. Zygarde is the opposite, quiet and distributed and aware of things that no creature of concentrated form could possibly monitor from a single location. Its power is most itself in the moment before it becomes visible at all. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, Zygarde represents a mystery about the relationship between consciousness and physical form, about whether intelligence requires a concentrated body or whether it can exist usefully in a distributed state spread across thousands of small components. The Pokemon world's answer appears to be that it can, but the conditions under which that distributed intelligence chooses to concentrate, to take a body and act in the world rather than simply observing it, remain one of the more genuinely uncertain questions in the geography of the Pokemon universe. The ultra wormholes that began appearing in the Alola region during the events of the 7th generation games were not the first documented intrusions from dimensions beyond the Pokemon world, but they were the first that occurred on a scale large enough to generate a formal response from the regional government. The creatures that emerged from those wormholes, classified as ultra beasts by the organization formed to study and manage them, shared no common ancestor with any known Pokemon, belonged to no existing evolutionary family, and operated according to biological principles that the Alola research community has not been able to fully explain. Each Ultra Beast represents a form of life that developed entirely independently of the Pokémon world, in a dimension with different physical laws, different ecological pressures, and in some cases, a different relationship between biological matter and energy. The variety among them is not the ordinary variety of a single world's biodiversity. It is the variety of worlds that had no contact with each other, producing solutions to the problem of being alive that share no common grammar. The research organization that had been studying ultraspace had documented some of the ultra beasts under different classifications before the crisis that revealed this research to the wider public. The working theory treated ultra beasts as threats to be neutralized rather than entities to be understood, an approach that the events of the Alola games did not entirely vindicate, but also did not entirely contradict. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at how ultra beasts interact with the physical environment of the Pokemon world after their arrival. They do not simply occupy the spaces they appear in, they alter them. The organism known as Nihilego produces toxins that affect the behavior of humans in ways that resemble a kind of symbiosis from Nihilego's perspective. Whether Nihilego understands what it is doing to its hosts, or whether the relationship it pursues is a genuine form of connection within its own framework of what connection means, is a question that the available research does not answer cleanly. The possibility that ultraspace contains more than what has been formally documented, that the wormholes have allowed through only a fraction of what exists beyond them, is one that the Alola research program acknowledged in its internal reports but did not publicize. The scale of what might be beyond the documented openings is large enough that acknowledging it directly tends to produce a specific kind of unease. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the Ultra Beasts represent the Pokemon world's clearest acknowledgement that its existence does not exhaust the possibilities of what could exist. There are other worlds, not simply parallel versions of this one, but genuinely other places, where life developed along paths that share no common origin with anything in the world that trainers know. The wormholes that opened over Alola were windows, and what was visible through them, if looked at honestly, was larger than the frame. The Ether Foundation did not begin with the project that produced type, Null. The project grew from a research program that began with a specific question about the ancient legends describing creatures capable of defeating Ultra Beasts. The program set out to create a Pokemon that could match them, a being of synthetic origin that would carry the strengths of multiple Pokemon types simultaneously. The creation process required the splicing together of biological material from multiple Pokemon specimens, a procedure that produced a creature of enormous power but unstable temperament. The instability was not unexpected by the researchers, who had anticipated that a being carrying such a concentration of competing biological systems would struggle to integrate them smoothly. What the researchers had not fully anticipated was the specific form that instability would take, a creature that was aware of its own origin and found it deeply, persistently painful. Type Null was fitted with a helmet described in the program documentation as a restraining device. The helmet's other function, not listed in the documentation but evident from the creature's behavior, was to contain the awareness that made its situation so difficult. A Pokemon that knows it was made from fragments of other Pokemon, that exists because of a project rather than because of the ordinary mechanisms of birth and growth, faces a particular kind of existential challenge that no training regimen was designed to address. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the relationship that ultimately allowed Type Null to evolve into Silvally. The bond required was not simply affection or consistent care, though both of those were present. It was recognition, a trainer seeing the creature as it actually was, rather than as the project document described it. Understanding that what had been created was not a weapon with behavioral issues, but a being with a history it had not chosen, and a longing for something that the program had not accounted for. The mask coming off in the moment of evolution is one of the more precise visual metaphors in the games for what trust between two beings looks like when it finally becomes possible. Silvally's capacity to change its type using special discs, mimicking the type effectiveness of any Pokemon in the world, is the fulfillment of the original research objective. But the creature that actually achieved that capability is not the one the program intended to create. The program intended a weapon. What the circumstances of care and recognition produced was something that chose its purpose rather than having it imposed. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, Silvally stands as a creature whose story is genuinely complete, a being that started as a project and became a person, that was treated as an instrument and chose relationship instead. The mystery that remains is not about Silvally itself, but about the other Null models the documentation references, but that the games do not account for, creatures that might still be somewhere in the world, helmeted and aware and waiting for a recognition that has not yet arrived. At some point in the deep history of the Galar region, a meteor struck the Earth and did not simply impact and cool. The object that arrived from space was not composed of the ordinary minerals and metals that meteoric events typically deliver to a planet's surface. It was, or it contained within it, a living thing. Eternatus arrived from outside the solar system and has been present in the geology of Galar ever since, embedded in the Earth in a way that ordinary geology does not account for. The energy that Eternatus radiates is the origin of the phenomenon that the Galar region calls the Darkest Day. In the distant past, the leakage of this energy from the place where the meteor rested caused Pokémon throughout the region to undergo a transformation called Gigantamaxing, an explosive increase in size accompanied by the expression of extraordinary power that was completely uncontrolled. The Darkest Day nearly destroyed the region, and its resolution required the intervention of two Pokémon remembered in Galar as legendary heroes. What the history of the Darkest Day does not fully explain is how those two heroes acquired the capacity to resolve a crisis driven by the energy of an extraterrestrial being embedded in the planet. They are not described in the ancient texts as having been designed for this purpose. They appear to have had a capability that was adequate to the crisis, a capability whose origin is simply not part of the record. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the relationship between Eternatus and the Dynamax phenomenon that defines the Galar region's relationship with Pokémon in the modern era. The Dynamax phenomenon, through which Pokémon in Galar temporarily grow to enormous size during battles in certain locations, is a stable, controlled version of the same energy interaction that produced the Darkest Day's uncontrolled disaster. What determines whether the energy interaction is controlled or not is not something the Galarian research community has been able to specify precisely. The possibility that Eternatus will eventually recover fully from its containment, and that the Darkest Day could occur again, this time without the legendary heroes who resolved it previously, is not discussed in the Galarian government's public communications. It is discussed in the research notes that accompanied the post-crisis documentation, which acknowledge both the incomplete nature of the containment and the fact that the specific conditions that allowed the first resolution cannot be guaranteed to replicate in a second crisis. This represents a form of ongoing uncertainty that the region has learned to live with quietly. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, Eternatus represents the Pokémon world's engagement with a particular kind of mystery. the arrival from outside of something that does not belong and cannot be removed, that must be lived with rather than resolved, and whose continued presence shapes the possibilities of everyone nearby. The Garla region's entire culture of Pokemon battles is built on the energy of a creature that arrived as a catastrophe and has been slowly accommodated into daily life. What Eternatus wants, whether it wants anything, and whether its accommodation was willing or simply the exhaustion of something that was not allowed to do what it came to do, remains unknown. There was a time, according to the traditions of the Crown Tundra in the northern reaches of the Galar region, when a king ruled who was unlike any king recorded elsewhere in Pokemon history. Calyrex is not described as a king in the political sense, as an individual who commanded territory and resources and other people. It is described as a king in the ecological sense, as a being whose relationship with the land and with the Pokemon who lived on it was one of active cultivation, of attending to the health of things that needed attending to, in a way that made the entire Crown Tundra more alive than it otherwise would have been. The powers that Calyrex exercised were specifically about growth and about the future. It could see what was going to happen, and it could use that knowledge to attend to the conditions that would allow what needed to happen, a form of gardening applied to time rather than simply to soil. The Crown Tundra in the era of Calyrex's active kingship is described as extraordinarily fertile, a northern region that should by climate alone have been harsh and sparse, but that under Calyrex's attention produced abundance. The change that ended that era is the part of the story that the traditions find most difficult to tell cleanly. The people of the Crown Tundra began to doubt Calyrex, not dramatically, not in a moment of specific conflict, but gradually, in the way that faith in anything erodes when circumstances change and the thing that was trusted does not obviously respond. A particularly difficult period, a time when the crops failed and the cold deepened and the land did not respond as it had responded before, shifted the community's relationship with its king. And Calyrex, without the belief of the people whose world it had been attending to, began to lose its power. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at what happened to Calyrex after the loss of its power. It did not leave the Crown Tundra. It stayed small and diminished, and essentially forgotten, in a place that no longer knew what it had once been. The landscape of the Crown Tundra eventually lost the extraordinary fertility of the Calyrex era and settled into the cold, sparse character that would be expected from a northern plateau, and the memory of what it had been passed out of ordinary knowledge into the kind of myth that is told without full understanding of what it describes. The process of restoring Calyrex to its full form and capacity requires the reconstruction of the relationship between the king and the community in a very specific way. It is not simply about finding the right items or reaching the right location. It requires something that resembles belief, an active commitment to the existence of something that most of the Crown Tundra's current residents have never seen. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, Calyrex's story is about the specific kind of loss that occurs not through destruction or violence, but through the quiet withdrawal of recognition. The moment when something extraordinary is no longer seen as extraordinary by the community that depends on it. The recovery from that kind of loss is slower and less certain than recovery from physical damage. What was forgotten must be remembered. What was disbelieved must be trusted again, and neither of those things happens automatically or quickly. The maps that show the major routes and towns of every Pokemon region are complete in the sense that they identify all of the significant structures and travel paths. They are not complete in the sense that they account for everything a careful traveler might notice while moving through the world. There are houses in various regions that appear on no official map, structures that exist at the edge of travel routes, and that contain within them the remnants of domestic life that ended at some point that nobody in the area can date precisely. The strange house in the Unova region is perhaps the most extensively documented of these structures. It is located in an area of marshland and can be reached by a trainer who is paying attention to the landscape rather than simply moving through it. The house is furnished to a degree that suggests someone recently lived there, But the Pokemon found inside are ghost types, and the events that occur when a trainer enters are experienced rather than explained. Text appearing on walls, a child's voice in empty rooms, something that can be understood as a record of grief left in the physical space where the grief occurred. The identity of the child whose presence inhabits the strange house, what happened to her, and why the particular form her story took was preserved in the way that it was, rather than simply dissipating over time, is information that the house offers only in fragments. There is a reference to a dream that would not stop. There is an object associated with Cresselia that connects the story to the Darkrai mythology. There is the sense of something unfinished, a question that was asked at the moment of crisis and has not yet received its answer. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at how abandoned houses recur across multiple regions without being connected to a single myth or explanation. The old chateau in the Sinnoh region has its ghost girl and its butler, presences that the ordinary research categories call residual haunting, the echo of strong emotion left in a physical space after the beings who generated it are gone. These structures are placed at the edges of traveled paths, in spaces that are neither wilderness nor settled community, suggesting something about what they represent in the geography of the Pokémon world. They are between places, structures that exist in the space between the ordinary routes of ordinary life and the extraordinary wilderness where legendary Pokémon live and ancient myths play out. What the abandoned houses and their ghost-type inhabitants tell us collectively about how the Pokémon world processes its own history of loss and grief is a question that has not been formally studied. But the pattern of their presence, scattered across regions that do not share a common political history, suggests that the world has been producing these in-between spaces for as long as it has been producing everything else. That the experience of grief and its residue in physical spaces is not a regional phenomenon, but a universal one. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the abandoned houses of the Pokémon world are perhaps the most honest thing the games contain, because they present the reality of loss without offering the relief of a complete explanation. Something ended here. Someone was in grief here. The specific details are offered only partially and must be assembled from what remains, which is always incomplete. The ghost types who occupy these spaces are not monsters to be defeated. They are occupants of a moment that never finished, living in the echo of something that happened before the player arrived and will continue after they leave. There are 108 spirits bound together inside a stone called the Odd Keystone, and the name Spiritomb is applied to whatever it is that emerges when those spirits are present inside the keystone in sufficient concentration. The number 108 is specific enough to be meaningful, carrying resonance in Buddhist tradition as the number of worldly desires that bind a being to suffering, a connection that the Sinnoh region's older communities have historically found significant, without being able to say whether the designers of Spiritomb's composition intended that significance or arrived at it by a different route. How 108 spirits came to be inside a single stone is a question the Pokédex raises and the games do not answer in any satisfying way. The available entry describes it as being bound to the keystone for misdeeds, which implies a judicial or disciplinary process, an authority capable of collecting spirits and placing them together under circumstances that constituted punishment. Whether that authority was a human institution, a legendary Pokémon acting in some enforcing capacity, or something else entirely is not indicated. What Spiritomb's combined presence generates is a type combination, Ghost and Dark, that was for many years uniquely immune to every attacking type in the game, a detail that has attracted significant attention from the competitive battling community without generating any corresponding research into why a combination of 108 bound spirits would produce this particular effect. The type combination feels like it was arrived at conceptually rather than mechanically, as if the composition of Spiritomb suggested those types rather than the types being chosen first and the composition built around them. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the physical relationship between Spiritomb and the odd keystone. The spirits within the stone do not simply occupy it the way a creature occupies a shelter. They are bound to it in a way that makes the keystone both their home and their constraint, a physical object that is simultaneously the thing keeping them together and the thing preventing them from going anywhere else. A shadow that has been visited by its full assembled form is indistinguishable afterward from a shadow that has not. What they witness from their position inside the stone, what understanding they have developed across the generations they have spent together, is something the record has not attempted to describe. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, Spiritomb is a mystery about collectivity and constraint, about what happens to individual identity when a sufficient number of separate beings are brought together under conditions that do not allow for separation. The 108 is a specific number, specific enough to have been chosen, and the tradition it echoes is specific enough that the echo feels intentional. Whether it is possible to be 108 things at once without ceasing to be any of them individually, and whether what Spiritomb experiences is closer to community or to confinement, are questions that the games present implicitly and leave entirely open. In the frozen mountains of the Sinnoh region, there is a chamber that has been sealed for longer than the towns in the valley below have existed. Inside that chamber is a creature described in the mythology of multiple regions as the thing that moved the continents of the Pokémon world into their current configuration. A being of such physical scale and force that the arrangement of the world's land masses is understood to be a product of its labor rather than of geological processes alone. Regigigas is the master of the three legendary titans, Regirock, Regis, and Registeel, creatures that themselves were objects of reverence in the communities of Hoenn and later Sinnoh. The relationship between Regigigas and the titans is described in the ancient texts as one of origin and derivation. Regigigas is said to have modeled the three titans from the materials of the world itself, from rock and ice and iron, giving them form and then leading them as it performed the work of moving continents. When the work was complete, the titans were sealed away, and Regigigas was sealed in its chamber in the north. Why Regigigas was sealed, rather than simply allowed to remain present in the world, is a question whose answer exists only in traditions that have been passed through many generations without verification. The most common account describes a community that feared what Regigigas could do if it remained active, and who performed whatever ritual was required to put the Colossus into a form of sleep from which it would not easily wake. The fear that motivated the sealing is described as understandable without being described as justified, a distinction that the traditions find meaningful. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the mechanical expression of Regigigas' situation in the games. When encountered, Regigigas is afflicted with an ability that reduces its effectiveness for the first several turns of battle, a reflection of the long period of dormancy it has spent in the sealed chamber. As an expression of what it means to have been asleep for an unmeasured geological period, and then awakened suddenly into conflict, it is one of the more literal and quietly honest design choices in the entire game system. The relationship between Regigigas and the arrangement of the continents means that the Pokémon world, as it currently exists, with its regions separated by oceans, its land masses having the specific shapes and positions that allow for the patterns of travel and encounter that the games are built around, is understood to be the result of intentional labor. The world was arranged by something. The land is where it is because something moved it there. This understanding of the world's configuration as artifact rather than accident is one of the background assumptions of Pokémon mythology that tends not to be examined directly, but that changes the feel of the world if it is examined. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, Regigigas represents a mystery about scale and dormancy, and the specific kind of loss that occurs when something capable of enormous things is put into a sleep that reduces it to helplessness. The Colossus that moved continents rests in a sealed chamber in the northern mountains and its first moments after waking are its weakest. These contrasts are held together in the mythology without irony, presented as simply the way things are, as if the Pokemon world understands, without needing to say explicitly, that the things capable of the most extraordinary acts are frequently the things that spend the most time completely still. In the ancient history of the Unova region, there was a dragon so vast and so complete that the mythology describes it as containing within itself the totality of what a dragon could be. The original dragon of Unova was not simply powerful. It was the convergence of two contradictory ideas, truth and ideals, held in balance by two brothers who each understood only one half of what the dragon represented. When the brothers separated, when each took the part of the dragon that corresponded to his own understanding and called it complete, the original dragon divided. What had been a single unified creature became two distinct beings, each genuinely powerful, each genuinely limited by the absence of what it had given away. Reshiram carries truth. Zekrom carries ideals. And the mythology of the Unova region is built around the long argument about which of these is more important. An argument that the games engage with seriously without resolving. The portion of the original dragon that remained after Reshiram and Zekrom separated became Kyurem, a creature described as an empty shell, a body without the fire or thunder that once animated the whole. Kyurem persists in the giant chasm at the northern edge of Unova, in a state that the research community describes as incomplete, but that might more accurately be described as waiting. It can temporarily merge with either Reshiram or Zekrom, creating a form that approaches but does not reach what the original dragon was. The mechanism by which full reunion might occur, if it is possible at all, is not described anywhere in the available mythology. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at what the separation of the original dragon means for the world it was part of. A world that contained a dragon of that completeness was a different kind of world than the one that exists after the division. The Unova region, which the games present as urban and modern, and concerned with the ethics of the trainer-Pokemon relationship, is built on a foundation of ancient grief. The grief of a totality that chose to divide and cannot easily choose to come back together. Every argument in Unova about truth and ideals is, in some sense, a continuation of the brothers' original disagreement. The descendants of those brothers have appeared across multiple generations of Unova games, each carrying some version of the original conviction, each choosing either truth or ideals as the pole around which their understanding of the world organizes itself. Whether any of them have understood what they were inheriting, the particular shape of a loss that is not recoverable through winning the argument, is unclear from the documentation. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the original dragon represents a mystery about what happens to a wholeness that divides itself along a fault line that cannot be healed by simply choosing one side or the other. Reshiram and Zekrom are both extraordinary. They are also both incomplete. And Kyurem, waiting in the cold of the giant chasm, is the part that neither of them claimed, the hollow remainder of something that was once everything a dragon could be. The phenomenon that the Pokemon world calls evolution is not the same process that biologists use the word to describe. In the Pokemon world, evolution occurs within the lifetime of a single individual, transforming a Caterpie into a Butterfree within days, or a Magikarp into a Gyarados after sufficient training. The result of this transformation is not simply a larger version of the original, or a creature with more developed versions of its existing features. It is, in many cases, a fundamentally different kind of being. The relationship between a Pokemon before evolution and the same Pokemon after evolution is one of continuity in some respects and discontinuity in others. The evolved Pokemon remembers what it knew before. It retains the bond it had with its trainer. It maintains whatever personality traits it expressed in its earlier form. But its physical structure may have changed so completely that nothing of the pre-evolution form is visibly present in the new body. A transition so total that the word transformation does not quite describe it. The biological mechanism by which a caterpie becomes a butterfree is not explained anywhere in the official research of the Pokémon world. The Pokédex records the fact of evolution without engaging with the process. The professors who have dedicated their careers to understanding Pokémon do not, in any documented statement, offer a mechanical explanation for what happens in the moment of evolution, the flash of light, the change of form, the emergence of something new from what was present before. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the conditions under which evolution occurs. For many Pokémon, it is triggered by experience, by the accumulation of effort and learning in the presence of a trainer who is investing in the Pokémon's development. For others, it is triggered by specific locations, by emotional states, by exposure to particular stones or items, by time of day, by friendship. The variety of triggers is so great that no single mechanism could account for all of them, which suggests that evolution in the Pokémon world is not a single process, but a name applied to a range of related phenomena that share the characteristic of fundamental change. The cases where evolution involves emotional states as triggers are perhaps the most philosophically interesting. A Pokémon that evolves when it reaches a sufficient level of friendship with its trainer is evolving in response to the quality of a relationship rather than to any physical condition. Something in the Pokémon changes in response to being loved and trusted to a sufficient degree. What that something is, and why love and trust should have the biological consequence of fundamental physical transformation, is a question the Pokémon world has not answered. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the mystery of Pokémon evolution is one that the world treats as fully ordinary, a thing that happens to every Pokémon in the course of a trainer's journey, a source of celebration and progress rather than wonder. But the thing being celebrated, if looked at directly, is deeply extraordinary. The capacity of a living being to become fundamentally different from what it was, to carry its identity through a transformation so complete that the before and after share almost nothing physically, and to emerge from that transformation with the relationship it had before still intact. The mechanism that allows this is unknown. The fact that it happens is perhaps the most remarkable thing in a world full of remarkable things. Every trainer in the Pokémon world understands their Pokémon, and every Pokémon understands their trainer, in a way that neither species has developed a formal account of. The communication between humans and Pokémon is not accomplished through a shared language in the ordinary sense. Pokémon do not speak the language of the region they live in, with a small number of highly specific exceptions. Humans do not speak the various vocalizations that different Pokémon species use among themselves, and yet there is understanding. The understanding is not simply behavioral. A Pokémon that has been with a trainer for a long time develops responses to that specific person's emotional states, to the particular quality of how that person gives instructions in a moment of difficulty, to the specific patterns of trust and expectation that develop between individuals over shared time. This is something more than reading body language, though that plays a role. It is something more like a mutual legibility that develops through relationship, a quality of being known that builds between two beings who have chosen each other. The cases in the games where Pokémon communicate with trainers in ways that are specific and non-generic are treated as part of the ordinary texture of the trainer-Pokémon relationship, but they imply a channel of communication that has never been formally described. A Pokémon calling out in a way its trainer understands as distress. A Pokémon expressing something the trainer receives as opinion or preference in a context where the trainer had not expected to receive either. These moments suggest a depth of mutual understanding that goes well beyond what the mechanics of training alone would predict. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the Pokédex entries that describe how certain Pokémon respond specifically to kind treatment, to gentle attention, to the particular quality of care that some trainers provide and others do not. The entries use language like feel, sense, and understand in ways that attribute to Pokémon an interior life sophisticated enough to recognize the difference between being cared for and being managed. These attributions appear across hundreds of entries with a consistency that suggests the Pokédex is describing something that is simply observed, something that any researcher who pays attention to Pokémon over time will encounter. What the Pokemon world has not formally addressed is whether the communication that develops between trainers and Pokemon is unique to those specific pairs. The evidence from the games suggests that the bonds are specific, that a Pokemon does not relate to every human it encounters the way it relates to its own trainer. But the mechanism of that specificity, what makes one relationship generate communication and another not, is unknown. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the communication between humans and Pokemon is one of the mysteries that is so thoroughly embedded in the ordinary life of the Pokemon world that it tends not to be recognized as a mystery at all. But it is one. Two species with no shared evolutionary history, no shared neural architecture, regularly develop relationships of genuine mutual understanding. What allows that to happen, why the capacity is present in both humans and Pokemon, is a question the Pokemon world carries in the fabric of every trainer's daily experience without ever quite examining it directly. There are creatures in the Pokemon world that carry meteorites as a part of their body, creatures that are descended from the same cosmic event that brought material from beyond the planet's atmosphere into contact with the life that was already here. Deoxys is the most complete expression of this category, a Pokemon described in its Pokédex entry as originating in space, having mutated from a virus present in a laser beam directed at a meteor. The mutation produced something that has no analog in the biology of the Pokemon world, a creature whose core is made of crystalline material not native to the planet, and whose capacity to change its own physical form instantaneously sets it apart from every other known species. The four forms that Deoxys can take, attack, defense, speed, and normal, are not the result of evolution or environmental adaptation. They are the result of Deoxys choosing a configuration. The capacity to reconfigure its own body in response to perceived need is a kind of biological flexibility that no other Pokemon possesses to this degree. It is also a capacity that raises deep questions about what kind of selfhood Deoxys has, whether a being that can become four fundamentally different physical configurations at will experiences itself as one thing or many. The relationship between Deoxys and the Rayquaza of the Pokémon world is one of the more unusual interspecies dynamics documented in the games. Rayquaza perceived Deoxys's arrival as an intrusion, a threat to the world it existed to protect, and engaged it in conflict rather than observation. The conflict was resolved, but the nature of the resolution, whether it constituted a truce, an expulsion, or something else, is not described clearly in any available text. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at what Deoxys might have been before the mutation that created it. The virus at the origin of its existence was, in some sense, alive before the mutation occurred. What that pre-mutation existence was like, what kind of entity it was, and what it experienced, if anything, in the cosmic environment before the laser and the meteor and the biological transformation, is a question that the biology of the Pokemon world is not equipped to answer. Deoxys arrived as something new, but it arrived from something older, and what that older thing was has no name in any documented language. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, Deoxys represents the Pokemon world's engagement with a question that even the most comprehensive Pokédex entries cannot fully address. What does it mean for something to be from somewhere else entirely? Not just from a different region, but from outside the biological history of the planet. Deoxys carries within its crystalline core the evidence of an origin that the world it now inhabits has no context for. It is, in the most literal sense, a mystery that arrived from outside the frame. In the long tradition of Pokémon that inhabit the edges of visibility, Marshadow occupies a particular position. It is described as living in the shadows that other creatures cast, slipping into the shadows of people and Pokémon with a subtlety that makes most interactions with it invisible to the people involved. The shadows that belong to other beings become, in Marshadow's presence, temporary homes that it examines from the inside, learning what it learns from observing what casts the shadow rather than the shadow itself. The mythology surrounding Marshadow is sparse compared to the mythology associated with creatures of equivalent rarity. The tradition that introduced Marshadow formally to most audiences treated it as a being connected to the inheritance of heroic souls, a creature that guards something about the essence of what heroes were and what they stood for, holding it in the shadows where it cannot be seen, but also cannot be lost. This framework gives Marshadow a function that is archival rather than active, less about doing things and more about preserving something that the world might otherwise allow to fade. The capacity that Marshadow is most notable for is its ability to copy the movement and techniques of other fighters by watching and then inhabiting their shadow during practice or combat. This is a form of learning that bypasses the ordinary channels of effort and repetition, creating in Marshadow a repository of styles and techniques accumulated from whoever it has observed over what may be an enormous period of time. Whether Marshadow understands what it copies in the way that a practitioner understands their own technique, or whether it holds what it copies the way a recording holds sound, is not clear from the available evidence. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at what Marshadow witnesses from its position inside the shadows of heroes and trainers and ordinary Pokémon alike. What understanding it has developed of the beings it has accompanied without their knowledge, and what it does with that understanding, are questions that the existing record provides no answer to. The creature is present in the world in a way that is consistent and purposeful, but its purpose remains abstract enough that the practical specifics of what guarding the essence of heroism involves in daily practice are not something the documentation has reached. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, Marshadow represents a kind of mystery that is about observation rather than action, about the capacity to be present in the world in a way that does not disturb the world, and to learn from that presence in ways that no other form of learning could provide. What it does with what it learns, and what the shadows of the world's heroes contain that is worth guarding, are questions the Pokémon world has raised more gently than most of its mysteries, and has left correspondingly more open. There is a device in the Pokémon world so ordinary that most trainers handle dozens of them without pausing to consider what they are actually doing. The Pokéball is the instrument through which the entire trainer-Pokémon relationship is made possible. A small sphere that can contain within itself creatures of any size, creatures of any power, creatures that move oceans and shape weather and exist across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The mechanism by which a Pokéball accomplishes this is one of the foundational mysteries of the Pokémon world, addressed nowhere in the games in terms that would satisfy a serious inquiry. The official description of Pokéball technology describes a process of converting Pokémon into energy and storing that energy within the capsule. This description is offered briefly and then not revisited, because to revisit it is to encounter a set of questions that the available science of the Pokémon world cannot resolve. What kind of energy can contain the totality of a living being? Does the Pokémon experience anything while it is stored inside the capsule? Is the Pokémon that emerges from the ball the same individual that entered it, in the sense that matters most? The question of Pokémon experience inside a Pokéball is one that players and researchers have engaged with extensively, partly because it seems important, and partly because the games offer small details that make it difficult to dismiss. Pokémon that are unhappy with their trainer will sometimes resist returning to the ball. Pokémon that have been away from their ball for long periods report, in behavioral terms, something that resembles relief when they are allowed to rest. These observations suggest that the interior of a Pokéball is not simply blank, not simply a state of suspended non-experience, but something that has a quality that can be better or worse. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the relationship between the capsule's containment and the Pokémon's physical scale. A Wailord, the largest Pokémon in the game system, can be stored in the same standard capsule as a Joltik, one of the smallest. The energy conversion that allows this must account for a difference in mass and volume so extreme that the physics required to explain it have not been described in any published research. The casual ease with which trainers manage this transition, storing and releasing creatures of wildly different scale without any particular ritual or preparation, suggests that the technology is so well established in this world that its fundamental strangeness has become invisible. The oldest Pokeballs documented in the historical record are called apricorn balls made from the hollowed and treated fruit of specific trees. These ancient versions of the technology, which predate industrial manufacture, carried within them a different philosophy of containment than modern capsules, one that was more attentive to the relationship between the organic material of the ball and the organic nature of what it held. The communities that developed these early containment tools understood something about the process that their descendants, using mass-produced capsules, may have allowed to become background knowledge rather than active understanding. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the Pokeball is a mystery disguised as a piece of ordinary equipment, a device so common in the Pokemon world that its strangeness has been absorbed into the ordinary. But the strangeness is real. The conversion of a living being into energy, the storage of that energy in a small sphere, the reconstitution of the living being from stored energy on demand, these are processes that would be considered extraordinary in any other context. In the Pokemon world, they are simply how things are, and how things are is sometimes the most mysterious category of all. There are places in the Pokemon world that were built for research and then abandoned, left to the weather and the water and whatever Pokemon moved in after the researchers departed. The Sea Mauville off the coast of the Hoenn region is one of these places, a former research facility on a platform in the ocean that has been decommissioned long enough for its corridors to feel genuinely old. The documents left behind in its cabinets and its storage rooms describe a research program that was not completed. A set of questions about energy and evolution and the natural world that ended not with answers, but with funding problems and organizational decisions that are not fully explained in any surviving record. What the Sea Mauville contains, beyond the documents and the Pokémon that have established themselves in its quiet spaces, is a quality of incompleteness that is different from ordinary abandonment. The researchers who worked there did not simply leave. They left in the middle of something, at a point in the investigation when the questions they were asking were becoming more interesting rather than less. The research notes that remain describe observations that had not yet been fully processed, data that was collected and then never analyzed because the people who would have analyzed it were no longer there. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the specific nature of the research that was being conducted on the Sea Mauville, and the connection between that research and the events that would later unfold in the Hoenn region involving energy sources that the original researchers had been investigating. The work that was abandoned on the platform may have been more directly relevant to what came after than the historical record has acknowledged. The gap between the end of the Sea Mauville program and the beginning of the events in the games is a gap in which the questions being asked shifted from one institution to another, and something may have been lost in that transition. The Pokémon that live in the Sea Mauville now are comfortable in its rusted hallways and its waterlogged lower levels, creatures that have adapted to a space that was built for human purposes and that continues to serve in modified form as habitat for things that were never part of the original plan. This is a common pattern in the Pokémon world, structures built for one thing becoming something else over time, the human intention leaving a shape that nature fills with its own content. The Sea Mauville is a particularly clear instance of this pattern, a facility that was built for inquiry and became, after the inquiry ended, a home. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the abandoned research vessels and decommissioned facilities scattered across the various Pokémon regions tell a collective story about the relationship between human curiosity and the world that curiosity is directed at. The questions that were being asked in those places were real. The people asking them were serious. The fact that they stopped for reasons that are often not preserved in the documents that remain, is one of the quieter mysteries of a world that is full of louder ones. What might have been learned, what might have changed in the understanding of the world if those inquiries had continued, is information that is simply not available. The sea has settled over those questions, and the Pokémon that live in the spaces where the researchers used to work are, in their way, a kind of answer to a question that was never quite asked. There are ruins in the Pokemon world that no expedition has fully mapped. The ruins of Alph are perhaps the most frequently visited, studied enough that researchers from multiple regions have contributed to the documentation. And yet, the fundamental question they raise, what the unknown that cover their walls were communicating, and to whom, has not been resolved in any of those documents. The Tantu ruins in the same region carry inscriptions that describe a different set of ancient events, a different layer of the world's past, laid down in stone, while the stone was still new enough to accept impressions clearly. The pattern that emerges when these ruins are examined collectively, from Alph to the ancient shrines of Sinnoh, to the stone structures of Hoenn, to the towering remains visible in Unova, to the carved stone presences in the island chains of Alola, is one of intentionality across enormous spans of time and geography. Someone or something was building with similar motivations across distances that would have made coordination by ordinary means impossible. Whether the common element in all these structures is unknown, or Arceus' influence made visible in stone, or something that neither of those explanations fully captures, is unknown. The communities that live near these ruins have developed relationships with them that are different from the relationships that academic researchers develop. Local traditions describe the ruins not as relics of a dead past, but as ongoing presences, structures that continue to do whatever it was they were built to do, operating below the threshold of what ordinary observation can confirm. The academic researchers tend to focus on what the ruins meant when they were new. The local communities tend to behave as if the ruins are still being used by whatever built them. Neither approach has produced a definitive account of what these structures are for. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at how Pokémon behave near ancient ruins compared to how they behave in ordinary wilderness. The populations of Pokémon that establish themselves in and around ruin sites tend to include species not typically found in the surrounding environment. Creatures drawn by something specific to these locations that ordinary habitat analysis does not identify. The presence of ghost types in these spaces is well documented and often attributed to the association between ruins and the residue of past lives. But the specific species that appear and the patterns of their distribution within ruin sites rather than simply around them suggest that the ruins offer something more particular than simply the general quality of age. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the ancient ruins of the Pokémon world hold a category of mystery that is about what was communicated across enormous time to whatever was present to receive the communication. The ruins were built by someone who intended them to last, who made them out of material chosen for permanence, who inscribed them with symbols chosen for meaning. The message has survived. The receiver remains uncertain. And the Pokémon that live among the stones, going about their ordinary lives in spaces that were once the sites of extraordinary intention, are perhaps the most appropriate inhabitants of a mystery that is still, in its quiet way, ongoing. As we drift toward the final quiet moments of this journey, it becomes clear that the mysteries of the Pokémon world are not puzzles that have simply not yet been solved. They are questions that the world holds deliberately. Spaces left open because closure would cost something that the world is not willing to pay. A world without mystery about its origins is a finished world. A world that keeps these questions open is one that continues to grow. The Lake Trio gave knowledge and emotion and will to living creatures without explaining why, without leaving a record of the decision or the moment it was made. Arceus shaped a universe, and the shape it made contains Pokémon that were engineered in laboratories, and ones that travel through time, and ones that guard antimatter dimensions, and ones that are 108 spirits bound together in a stone. All of these things are in the same world, and none of them dissolve each other's strangeness. The trainers who move through this world, collecting badges and filling Pokédexes and building teams, are moving through something that is genuinely not fully understood by anyone in it. The professors who watch from their labs, the champions who defend their titles, the researchers in ruins who decipher texts that may or may not translate correctly, all of them are operating within a world that keeps its most fundamental questions open. None of them have the full picture. None of the pictures that any of them have are wrong. Exactly. They are simply incomplete in the way that every honest picture of an enormous thing is incomplete. The Pokémon world is full of light, full of color and movement, and the specific happiness of finding something you were looking for exactly where you hoped it would be. And underneath all of that light, in the spaces between the routes and the towns, in the lakes and the ruins and the abandoned houses, and the dimensional tiers and the sealed chambers in the mountains, there are questions that have been waiting patiently for longer than memory records, shaped like mysteries, content to remain exactly as they are. Every generation of trainers that passes through those spaces inherits the questions without inheriting the answers. And perhaps that is not a loss, but an inheritance of a different kind, the specific gift of a world that trusts the people moving through it to be worthy of its unanswered questions. A world that gave its mysteries to those who would carry them gently, who would not demand answers on a schedule, who would allow the not knowing to be part of the experience rather than a problem requiring resolution. AZ walked through 3,000 years with a grief he could not put down. And when he finally could, the world was still there, still asking the same questions it had been asking before he arrived. Mewtwo left the island with a philosophy it had built from the material of its own pain, and the island remained, burned and silent, still holding the question of what responsibility means. The Unown stayed in their ruins, arranged in formations that no one has fully translated, still waiting to be read by whoever arrives prepared to receive what they have been saying for longer than the towns around them have existed. Darkrai stays on its island, Celebi drifts through its private timeline. The Lake Trio rests beneath cold water. Giratina turns slowly in a dimension where physics are courteous suggestions. Calyrex waits in the Crown Tundra for the moment when belief becomes possible again. Regigigas sleeps in the mountain, slower than the mountain itself, patient in the way that only something truly enormous can afford to be. The Unown arrange themselves in their formations. The burned tower stands in Ekritique with its memories of fire. And somewhere in the deep waters between regions, Mewtwo moves through the dark of the ocean with a philosophy it built from nothing and has carried ever since, still thinking, still asking questions that no laboratory ever asked on its behalf. These are not isolated mysteries. They are part of the same story, told across many games and many generations of players, about a world that is larger than any single journey can map and deeper than any single Pokédex can describe. The mystery of Mew's genetic archive, and the mystery of the Pokéball, and the mystery of Unown, and the mystery of time, and the mystery of what a burned tower means for the creatures that died in it and came back different. All of these are part of the same conversation, the same ongoing inquiry into what this world is and how it got to be this way. The mysteries rest here now, exactly where they have always rested, and the world that holds them is richer for the holding, more alive for the questions than it would ever be for the answers. Every unanswered question in the Pokémon world is a space kept open, a room whose door has not been closed, a lake that has not been fully sounded. The depth of those spaces is part of what makes the world worth returning to, year after year, game after game, night after night. There is a house in Pokémon Diamond and Pearl that does not appear on any regional map, tucked at the end of a route, so easy to walk past that many players complete the entire game without ever finding it. Inside the house lives a single person who claims to be 130 years old. There are no other characters in the room. There is no explanation offered for the age. The house exists at the edge of the route, presents its resident without context, and leaves the player to decide what to do with the information. The possibility that this character is simply a joke, a small absurdist detail left in the game for players who pay close attention, is the simplest available explanation. But the Sinnoh region contains enough genuine mythology about time and the disruption of temporal processes that a character of impossible age sits in an interesting position relative to the region's larger themes. The Lake Trio altered consciousness, the temporal legendary bent the flow of time. The creation myth describes a period before time existed as a category. In that context, a person who has lived for 130 years without any explanation is a detail that the region's mythology makes room for even if it never addresses it directly. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at how the Pokémon games scatter these anomalies throughout their worlds. Small things that are clearly more than decoration and less than full explanation. A person living too long in a region where time bends. A child in an empty house who might be a dream. A character who appears in multiple places simultaneously without any mechanical account of how that is possible. Each of these is placed in the world with enough care that dismissing it entirely feels like a mistake, but not enough explanation that building a complete theory around it feels warranted. What these small anomalies suggest collectively is a world that is porous at its edges, where the rules that govern the middle of things become suggestions at the periphery. The 130-year-old resident of the house on the route is perhaps the clearest expression of this quality, a person who exists at the edge of what the world officially contains, and who sits there patiently without requiring anyone to account for them. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, these marginal details are the kind that linger longest after a playthrough ends. The legendary Pokémon are remembered because they are large and powerful and central to the narrative. But the 130-year-old in the house at the end of the route is remembered for a different reason, because it raises a small question that the game never answers, and that question is still there the next time you think about it. Unchanged and patient in exactly the way that the very best mysteries tend to be. The concept of shiny Pokémon is one of the Pokémon world's most persistent and least explained phenomena. A shiny Pokémon is a specimen of a species whose coloration differs from the standard coloration of that species, presenting in alternative hues that occur at a rate of approximately 1 in several thousand encounters. The phenomenon is completely cosmetic in terms of battle effectiveness. A shiny Pokémon is not stronger or faster or more durable than an ordinary specimen of the same species. Its only distinction is its appearance. The rarity of the shiny coloration and the complete absence of any functional advantage it provides creates an interesting question about why the phenomenon exists at all within the logic of the Pokémon world. From a purely biological perspective, a coloration variant that is neither advantageous nor disadvantageous in a significant way would not be expected to be quite so rare. Ordinary biological variation appears constantly, and in many forms. The specific rarity of the shiny coloration, maintained across all species at approximately the same rate, suggests something more structured than random mutation. What the Pokémon world's research community has not addressed is the mechanism behind the shiny coloration, or why its rate of occurrence should be consistent across species as biologically different as Magikarp and Gengar and Dialga. The consistency suggests a common underlying cause rather than independent mutations in each lineage, but what that common cause might be is unknown. Some researchers have suggested that the shiny coloration is related to a specific genetic marker that was present in ancestral Pokémon populations, and that persists at a low frequency across all species descended from that origin. Given the mythology around Mew as the common ancestor of all Pokémon, this hypothesis is at least theoretically compatible with the established creation narrative. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at how communities within the Pokémon world treat shiny Pokémon when they are encountered. The reaction tends to be one of recognition rather than confusion. As if the concept of a differently colored specimen of a known species is familiar enough to have a place in the culture's existing categories, even if the biological explanation for it remains absent. This cultural familiarity suggests that shiny Pokemon have been present in the world for long enough that the experience of encountering one is not disorienting, only rare. The particular quality of the rarity itself is worth dwelling on. Something that occurs once in several thousand encounters is not vanishingly rare in a world where trainers regularly make thousands of encounters over the course of a journey. It is the kind of rarity that a person might encounter once in a lifetime of ordinary engagement with the world, or might seek deliberately if they had both the patience and the motivation. It is rare enough to be meaningful without being so rare that the possibility becomes theoretical. And the complete absence of any battle utility means that whatever meaning it carries is not about power, but about something else, about seeing something beautiful and unexpected, and entirely outside the ordinary run of experience. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, shiny Pokemon represent a kind of mystery that is embedded in the daily texture of the Pokemon world without disrupting it. A phenomenon so thoroughly integrated into the world's expectations that its fundamental inexplicability is simply part of the background. The world contains them. Trainers seek them. No one explains them. And in that comfortable acceptance of the unexplained, there is something that feels characteristic of the Pokemon world at its most honest. There is a tower in the Kalos region that stands at the boundary between a city and the wilderness surrounding it. A structure whose purpose the city has long since absorbed into its civic identity without retaining a clear account of what that purpose originally was. The Lost Hotel, by contrast, is a structure that most trainers in Kalos never find, accessible through a route that requires navigation through the kind of terrain the game does not make easy. Inside, scattered among the Pokemon that have established themselves in the debris, are fragments of notes that describe a place that was once something other than what it is now. The Pokemon world's abandoned buildings are rarely explained. They are presented as the residue of former habitation, evidence of communities or enterprises that ended at some point in the past, without any surviving account of exactly what ended and why. The Lost Hotel belongs to this category, but carries within its physical details enough specificity to make the absence of explanation feel pointed rather than simply incomplete. What was being done in the Lost Hotel, who was doing it, and why it ended in the particular way that the building's current state implies are questions that the notes left behind approach without answering. The notes are fragmentary by design, offering pieces of an account rather than the account itself. Whether this was a deliberate choice by the building's last occupants or simply the natural result of time and deterioration is not clear from the fragments themselves. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the Pokemon that inhabit the abandoned buildings of the Kalos region and the specific relationship those Pokemon have with the structures they occupy. A Pokemon that establishes itself in an abandoned building is not simply taking shelter. It is, over generations, becoming part of the building's history in a way that changes what the building means. The Lost Hotel's current residents are part of the place as much as its architecture, and what the place is now includes them as fully as it includes the notes and the debris. The Kalos region has more than its share of these in-between structures, places that sit at the edges of the ordinary routes and that reward the traveler who notices them with questions rather than answers. The relationship between the region's ancient history, the war and the weapon, and AZ's long grief, and the specific quality of the abandoned places within it is not made explicit anywhere in the games, but the presence of so many structures left incomplete, so many buildings that were something and became something else, and have not yet finished becoming whatever comes next, feels consistent with a region still processing what happened to it 3,000 years ago. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the abandoned buildings of Kalos are the region's way of carrying its past without requiring its present to constantly acknowledge it. They are the material form of history that has been set aside rather than resolved, places where something happened and then stopped, and the space was not cleared, but simply left as it was found at the moment of stopping. The Pokemon that live there now are not haunted in the ghost-type sense. They are simply present in the space that remains, indifferent to the human story the architecture still tells, content in the way that creatures tend to be content when the space they inhabit is sufficient for what they need. The Pokemon world's understanding of death is complicated by the existence of ghost types, by the documented cases of revival through extraordinary means, by the mythology of legendary Pokemon whose deaths and rebirths are woven into the creation stories of multiple regions. But the most direct engagement with ordinary mortality in the games is found not in the legendary mythology, but in the small details of Pokédex entries for species that exist in daily relationship with the end of things. Yamask carries with it a mask that the Pokédex describes as the face it had when it was alive as a human. This entry is presented without ceremony, as a fact about a ghost type rather than as the unsettling claim it actually is. If Yamask were human once, then the transformation from human to Pokémon represents a category of change that neither the human characters in the games nor the researchers who compiled the Pokédex address directly. Human beings become ghost types. This is in the Pokédex. The implications are not discussed. The relationship between the Yamask and the mask it carries is described as one of grief, of a creature that occasionally looks at the face it used to have and experiences something the entry describes as weeping. The continuity of identity that this implies, the Yamask's apparent awareness of having been something else and its emotional relationship to that former existence, suggests a kind of consciousness in ghost types that is qualitatively different from the consciousness attributed to ordinary Pokemon in ordinary entries. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the broader pattern of ghost types and human origin across the Pokédex. Yamask is the most explicit case, but other ghost types carry suggestions of human or sapient origin in their designs and in the language of their entries. The Pokemon world treats the boundary between the living and the not living, between the human and the Pokemon, as a boundary that certain circumstances can dissolve. And the entries that describe the creatures living on the other side of that boundary tend to do so with the same calm informational tone used to describe a Pokemon's preferred diet or habitat. The question of what happens to a person's consciousness during the transformation from human to Yamask is one that the Pokemon world raises by the very existence of the entry and then proceeds to offer no framework for answering. Whether the Yamask is the person it was, in a new form, or whether it is something new that carries only the memory of having been a person, is unknown. Whether the grief it experiences is the grief of the person it was, or the grief of a new creature contemplating the person whose face it carries, is also unknown. Both of these questions are raised by a single Pokédex entry that occupies 2 lines in a database of hundreds of entries. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the Yamask and creatures like it represent the Pokémon world's most direct and least resolved engagement with mortality and transformation. The world contains Pokémon that used to be human. This fact exists in the same reference document as the weight and height of Pidgey. Its presence there, unaccompanied by explanation or philosophical framework, is in its own way one of the most quietly extraordinary things in the entire canon of the series. At the northern edge of the Hisui region, which the modern world calls Sinnoh, there is a location described in the oldest texts as the place where space and time flow differently than they do elsewhere. The ancient people who lived in the Hisui region described this location with a particular kind of reverence, the kind reserved for places that are understood to be important without being understood to be safe. They left offerings there. They maintained a tradition of observation without approach, watching the area from a respectful distance during periods when the air around it changed quality. The Pokémon that the ancient Hisui communities associated with this location are the same ones that the people of the later Sinnoh region would eventually encounter through the events documented in the Diamond and Pearl games. But the relationship between the ancient community and these Pokémon was not the relationship between a trainer and a legendary Pokémon. It was closer to the relationship between a community and a natural phenomenon, something vast and present and intermittently active that the community had learned to accommodate without attempting to interact with directly. The gap between that ancient relationship and the modern one, in which a trainer carries the right items to an altar and initiates an encounter that results in a battle and potentially a capture, is a gap that the games acknowledge implicitly by providing the ancient context, but do not bridge explicitly. The temporal and spatial legendaries of Sinnoh are the same beings that the ancient Hisui community maintained its careful distance from. What changed between those two eras, in the beings themselves or in the communities that developed relationships with them, is not part of any formal record. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the physical evidence of the ancient Hisui community's engagement with these places. The shrines and structures they built in the vicinity of the most significant locations were not built to control or contain what was present there. They were built to mark the presence of something, to make visible the community's awareness of it, to create a physical record of the fact that the people who lived there knew that the place was different. This kind of architecture is not about power. It is about acknowledgement, about the specific form of respect that builds something durable to say we were here and we knew this was important, without claiming to understand it. The relationship between architecture and respect for the incomprehensible is a theme that runs through multiple regions of the Pokémon world, from the ancient ruins of Alph to the shrines of Hisui to the carved structures of Alola. The communities that built these places were not ignorant. They were, in a particular sense, more honest about the limits of knowledge than the researchers who arrived later with their taxonomies and their Pokédexes and their confident categorizations. They built things that said, "We notice," without claiming to say we know. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the ancient relationship between the Hisui community and the legendary Pokémon of what would become Sinnoh is a reminder that the history of the Pokémon world is not simply a history of increasing understanding. In some respects, it is a history of decreasing honesty about what is not understood. The ancient communities knew they did not understand. The modern research tradition sometimes forgets to say so. The Pokémon world contains within it a game that exists inside the games, a recursive layer of narrative that appears in limited form across multiple generations, but is most extensively developed in the Galar region. The games played in the Pokémon world, specifically the console game described in the Galar narrative as featuring a legendary Pokémon not otherwise documented, introduce a layer of meta-commentary that the series handles with characteristic subtlety. The legendary Pokémon Eternatus was real. The threat it represented was real. But the story that the community of Galar told about the Darkest Day was processed through the centuries into something resembling legend, and eventually into something resembling entertainment. By the time of the Sword and Shield games, the story of the ancient crisis had become cultural material, a story told in different ways by different people for different purposes. Some of those purposes straightforwardly informational, and others involving the specific distortions that entertainment requires. The question of how historical events become mythology and how mythology becomes entertainment is one that the Pokémon world rarely examines directly, but that the Galar narrative makes difficult to ignore. The story of Eternatus and the heroes who stopped it was true. The version of that story told in the present of the games is not exactly true in the same way. Something was lost in the transmission, and what was lost contributed to the community's failure to recognize the signs of the crisis recurring because they had been taught to think of those signs as story rather than as warning. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at how other regions of the Pokémon world have processed their own historical crises into cultural forms. The mythology of Johto's burned tower is preserved in performances and traditions that have maintained their emotional resonance while losing some of their historical specificity. The ancient war in Kalos is known in outline but not in detail, its emotional weight carried forward through the figure of AZ rather than through any comprehensive historical account. The creation mythology of Sinnoh is preserved in tablets that require specialized knowledge to interpret, and that the general population of the region knows mostly through simplified versions. What these patterns suggest is that the Pokemon world is a world in active relationship with its own past, neither fully preserving it nor fully forgetting it, finding forms that allow the past to remain present without requiring constant, direct engagement with its most difficult contents. This is a deeply human relationship with history, and it is one of the ways that the Pokemon world, for all its fantastical elements, continues to feel like a world that people actually live in, rather than a world that exists solely for the purpose of the games set within it. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the layers of storytelling within the Pokemon world, the way history becomes myth, becomes entertainment, becomes a different kind of history, are one of the more structurally interesting aspects of the canon. The mysteries embedded in those layers, about what was actually true and what was added in transmission and what was lost in the process of making something survivable enough to be passed on, are mysteries that no Pokédex entry addresses and no legendary encounter resolves. The Safari Zone is a concept that appears in multiple regions of the Pokemon world, a designated area where wild Pokemon can be encountered under conditions different from those of ordinary routes and caves. The existence of these zones implies a management structure for wild Pokemon populations, an institutional presence in the relationship between human development and wild habitats that the games touch on without fully exploring. The questions that arise from the existence of the Safari Zone extend to the broader question of how human expansion into the Pokemon world's wilderness has affected the creatures that inhabit it. The Pokemon world presents a version of human and natural coexistence that is, in the broad strokes, more harmonious than the relationship between human development and wildlife in the world as we know it. But the details, when examined, contain evidence of the same pressures that produce ecological disruption in any world where human activity and natural habitat overlap. Species that were once widespread appear in the games in limited locations, often specifically designated reserves or remote areas difficult for ordinary travelers to access. The Pokédex entries for these species frequently describe former ranges or behavioral patterns that imply historical populations different from current ones. Reading these entries collectively creates a picture of a world where the distribution of wild Pokemon reflects centuries of human activity in ways that the games present as the ordinary background of the world, rather than as a condition requiring acknowledgement. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the language used in Pokédex entries to describe population changes. Words like once and formerly and in ancient times appear more often than a casual reading of the Pokédex might suggest. Pokémon that were once found across wide territories now appear in specific locations. Behaviors described as natural have in many cases been shaped by the long history of human-Pokemon interaction in ways that make it difficult to distinguish the natural from the adapted. The Pokemon world's ecology, examined carefully, is as much a record of human history as it is a record of natural history. The way the games handle this complexity is largely by not drawing attention to it directly. The world feels vibrant and full of life. The routes feel populated. The wild encounters feel abundant. But the specific details of which Pokemon appear where and what the historical range data implied in the Pokédex entries reveals about how those distributions came to be tell a different story if read attentively. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the ecology of the Pokemon world is one of its quietest and most persistent mysteries. Not because the information is hidden, but because it is distributed across hundreds of individual entries in a way that requires assembling fragments rather than reading a single account. The world that assembles from those fragments is one that has been shaped by its own history in ways that are visible to anyone who pays close enough attention. A world that carries within its ordinary geography the evidence of everything that happened to produce it. There is a meteorite in the Pokemon world that has been studied by multiple research groups across multiple generations of games, without any of those research groups arriving at a complete account of what it contains or what it is doing in the locations where it has been found. The meteorites associated with the Belden line and with Deoxys represent one category of extraterrestrial material with documented biological relevance. But there is another category of meteorite in the Pokémon world, smaller and more widely distributed, whose significance has been noted in research logs and Pokédex entries without being resolved. The meteorites found in the Hoenn region during the events of the third generation games carry an energy signature that the research team studying them connected to the ancient disaster that brought Rayquaza into conflict with a creature from outside the solar system. These meteorites are old enough that their arrival predates any existing record, making them markers of an event that the current world knows only through inference from the physical evidence the event left behind. The Draconid people, whose traditions preserve the oldest knowledge of Rayquaza's role in the defense of the world, have long understood the meteorites as material evidence of that defense, stones left over from the conflict between the Guardian of the Sky and what arrived from outside it. Their relationship with these stones is archival rather than scientific, treating them as documents rather than samples. What the stones document, in this understanding, is the fact of an encounter that the world survived, physical evidence that something came from outside and was met and that the world continued after the meeting. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at how the energy within these meteorites interacts with Rayquaza's biology in the Generation 6 games set in the Hoenn region. The specific reaction that Rayquaza undergoes in the presence of accumulated meteorite energy is a form of transformation that shares some characteristics with Mega Evolution, but operates through a different mechanism, one that does not require the bond between a trainer and a Pokémon but only sufficient concentration of a particular kind of cosmic energy. This independence from the bond requirement sets it apart from almost every other known form of transformation in the Pokémon world. The implication is that Rayquaza's relationship with the cosmos is direct and ongoing in a way that other Pokemon's relationships with their environments are not. It does not need a trainer's emotional connection to access its fullest form. It needs the residue of the event that defined its role in the world, the material left over from the moment when it became what it is. This is a form of self-sufficiency that is, if considered carefully, quite different from what the other legendary Pokémon of Hoenn require to express their full power. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the meteorites of the Pokémon world are a category of mystery that is simultaneously geological and mythological. Objects that exist at the intersection of the physical record and the narrative record in a way that neither discipline alone can fully address. They are stones, and they are also evidence, and they are also the material form of a story about what happened when the world was young enough that its guardian had not yet been tested, and a thing arrived from outside to do the testing. The Safari Zone is a concept that appears in multiple regions of the Pokémon world, but the routes that connect the regions are perhaps the greater mystery. The world map of the Pokémon universe has expanded dramatically with each new generation, each new pair of games introducing a region that exists alongside, but largely separately, from the regions that preceded it. The relationship between these regions, how they connect geographically and politically and historically, is one of the most consistently underexplored aspects of the world's construction. Travel between regions is possible within the games. The ship routes and the tunnels and the occasional reference to international travel make it clear that Kanto and Johto share a border, that Hoenn is an island region accessible by sea from the mainland, that Sinnoh is a northern region that the southern regions know about. But the full geography of the Pokémon world, the map that would show all the regions in relation to each other and reveal the shape of the planet they are built on, has never been officially provided. This absence of a world map is one of the deliberate mysteries of the Pokémon franchise, maintained across decades of games and media, with a consistency that suggests intention rather than oversight. The world is large enough to contain all of the regions that have been introduced without those regions being obviously impossible to fit together. but the specific arrangement that would make them fit, the relative positions and distances that would allow for the travel times and the climate differences and the cultural relationships implied in the games, is information that Game Freak has chosen not to provide. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the cultural and historical connections between regions that are implied, but not mapped. The presence of certain Pokémon species in multiple regions suggests migration patterns or shared ancient habitats. The similar technological levels of the various regions in the modern game timeline suggest some degree of shared development. The occasional reference in one region's dialogue to events or places in another region suggests ongoing contact. All of these connections imply a larger world whose geography would, if revealed, explain the connections. But the geography is withheld, and the connections remain suggestive rather than explicit. The mystery of the world map is one that is not frightening or melancholic or philosophically destabilizing. It is simply a question about the shape of a world, about where things are in relation to each other. But in the context of a franchise that has been building its world for more than 25 years, the maintenance of that question, the ongoing refusal to provide the answer that would resolve it, is its own kind of statement about what the world is and what it is for. A world whose map is known is a world that has been fully contained. A world whose map is still unknown is a world that can still surprise you. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the unmapped world of Pokémon is the most persistent evidence that the franchise understands something important about the relationship between mystery and belonging. A world you can fully map is a world you have finished exploring. And the Pokémon world, through every generation of games and every new region introduced, has been careful to remain a world that has not yet been finished. There are Pokémon whose Pokédex entries describe experiences so internally rich and so specifically emotional that the question of whether the research community is using the word experience loosely or literally is one that the entries themselves seem to take seriously. Gardevoir's entry describes it as capable of sensing its trainer's feelings with such precision that it can anticipate needs before they are expressed. Espien's entry describes it as having developed its psychic powers through deep bonds with trainers over long periods of cohabitation. These entries do not describe behavioral mimicry. They describe something more like empathy, a capacity to feel into the inner states of another being and respond to what is found there. The question of Pokémon consciousness and emotional experience is one that the Pokémon world addresses constantly and obliquely, distributing the evidence across hundreds of Pokédex entries that individually seem like routine biological notes, and collectively describe a world full of beings with rich inner lives. The entries describe loneliness in Pokémon separated from their groups, grief in Pokémon that have lost companions, joy in Pokémon engaged in activities they find pleasurable, and something that functions as purpose or meaning in Pokémon whose Pokédex descriptions include accounts of what they care about and why. None of this is treated as philosophically significant within the world of the games. The Pokédex records these interior states with the same matter-of-fact tone it uses to record a Pokémon's preferred food source or the mechanism of its defensive behavior. The implication is that Pokémon having rich emotional and experiential lives is simply a fact about the world, known well enough to be included in reference documentation without requiring argument or justification. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at what this means for the ethics of the trainer relationship. If Pokémon experience loneliness and grief and joy and purpose, then the relationship between a trainer and their Pokémon is not the relationship between a person and a tool, or even a person and an animal, in the limited sense that the word animal implies in a world where human emotional experience is treated as the standard. It is a relationship between two beings, both of whom have interior lives complex enough to generate loneliness when separated and joy when together. The games present this relationship as the center of their emotional appeal without ever formally stating the ethical premises that make the emotional appeal coherent. What the Pokémon world says about consciousness By distributing the evidence across hundreds of Pokédex entries rather than arguing for it in a single speech or document, is perhaps the most elegant thing it does. It does not debate the question of Pokémon consciousness. It simply fills its reference documents with the evidence of that consciousness, entry by entry, and trusts the reader to assemble the picture. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the consciousness of Pokémon is a mystery that is hidden in plain sight, distributed so widely across the world's documentation that it functions as background rather than foreground, as the assumed condition of the world rather than a claim requiring defense. It is there in every entry that uses the word feel, in every account of a Pokémon that cares about something, in every description of a creature whose inner life is mentioned with the same casual confidence as its weight. The world knows that Pokémon are conscious. It has simply never found it necessary to make a formal announcement. There are colors in the Pokémon world that belong exclusively to legendary and mythical Pokémon, hues that do not appear in the palettes of ordinary species in quite the same way. Subtle distinctions that a careful observer begins to notice after enough time spent attending to the world's visual language. The specific gold associated with a legendary dragon, the particular quality of the white that defines a certain creation era Pokémon, the blue that appears in beings associated with the deep sea and temporal flow. These are not accidents of design. They are a system. The visual language of the Pokémon world is one of its most consistently maintained and least formally acknowledged aspects. The color relationships between Pokémon within the same thematic family, between legendary Pokémon associated with the same mythology, between creatures whose roles in the world's narrative are parallel, even if they are not explicitly related, create a kind of visual argument about the structure of the world that operates below the level of explicit statement. Type colors are the most obvious layer of this system. The consistent use of fire-associated oranges and reds, water-associated blues and teals, grass-associated greens. But beneath that layer is a more complex color language, one that relates the legendary Pokémon of different regions to each other across the world map, one that distinguishes ancient and powerful beings from newer and more ordinary ones through the specific quality of the light they seem to emit or absorb, one that gives each region a signature palette that accumulates through the colors of its native Pokémon into something that functions like a visual identity. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at how the color language of legendary Pokémon relates to the mythological role those Pokémon play. The beings associated with creation and with the deepest structures of the world tend toward colors that sit at the extreme ends of the visible spectrum, or that are described in the lore as containing within them the full range of light. The beings associated with specific domains, with time, with space, with emotion, with knowledge, tend toward colors that are more specific, more limiting, expressing through their visual presentation the particular nature of the domain they embody. This visual system is never explicitly described in any in-game text or research document. It exists as a layer of meaning that operates through perception rather than explanation, visible to anyone who pays attention without ever being pointed to by anyone in the world who knows it is there. It is the Pokémon world's equivalent of the architectural grammar of the ancient ruins, a system of meaning built into the world itself rather than documented about it. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the visual language of the Pokémon world is a mystery that belongs to the category of things known by looking rather than things known by reading. The documentation does not describe it. The characters do not discuss it, but it is there, consistent across decades of design, a system so deeply embedded in the world's visual identity that it has become part of what the world feels like before it becomes part of what the world says. There is a Pokémon called Mimikyu that lives beneath a cloth shaped to look like a different Pokémon, a cloth it fashioned and maintains with the specific intention of being approached by humans who would otherwise avoid it. The Pokémon it chose to resemble is the most recognized Pokémon in the world, the one whose image appears in merchandise and media everywhere. And Mimikyu's choice to model its disguise on that image is documented in the Pokédex as a deliberate decision made out of a specific motivation: the desire to be liked. The Pokédex entry for Mimikyu is one of the more directly melancholic things in the series, describing a creature so aware of its own unlikability that it constructed an entire external self to present to the world in place of what it actually is. The original drawing on which the disguise is based was apparently imprecise, a detail the entry includes as if it explains something about Mimikyu's character. And the discrepancy between the original image and the version Mimikyu wears has become something the community finds both charming and heartbreaking in equal measure. What Mimikyu actually looks like under the cloth is a question the games have approached with deliberate restraint. The implication is that the sight of its true form is in some way dangerous, not because of any aggressive action on Mimikyu's part, but because the form itself, if looked at, produces a reaction that the researchers studying it were not prepared for. The one researcher who looked directly was, according to the available account, unwell for weeks afterward. The reaction described is not one of horror or disgust. It is something less classifiable, a response to seeing something that the visual system does not have a category for. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at what Mimikyu's situation implies about the Pokémon world's relationship with fame and recognition. The most famous Pokémon in the world is so famous that a creature whose entire strategy for connection is to resemble something beloved chose it as the model for its disguise. This implies a world where the distribution of recognition is extremely uneven, where one creature's image has become so universal that the creatures who want connection most deeply have concluded that the most efficient path to that connection runs through resembling it. Whether Mimikyu's desire for connection is ever fulfilled through the disguise, whether the affection shown to its costumed form provides the creature beneath the cloth with what it was looking for, is a question the games raise. Through the existence of the disguise without resolving, the affection is real. Its recipient is hidden. What the hidden recipient makes of affection, directed at a representation of something else, is not something the Pokédex measures. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, Mimikyu is the Pokémon world's most direct portrayal of the longing for connection and the specific strategies that longing can drive. The cloth it wears is a solution to a problem, and like most solutions to the problem of wanting to be liked, it is also a barrier, a thing that places distance between the connection it is seeking and the self that is seeking it. The distance is the cost of the strategy. Whether Mimikyu has considered the cost is a question that, like the question of what is under the cloth, has been left carefully unanswered. In the coastal regions of Alola, there is a tradition associated with the full moon that involves leaving out bowls of specific foods near the ocean's edge after sunset. The tradition is maintained by communities whose grandparents' maintained it without anyone in the current generation being able to say with certainty what outcome the tradition is meant to produce. They maintain it because it was maintained before them, and because the absence of the offering, on the occasions when it has been forgotten, has been followed by conditions that the communities have decided to treat as evidence rather than coincidence. The connection between lunar cycles and Pokémon behavior is one of the better documented aspects of Pokémon biology, appearing in Pokédex entries across multiple regions and confirmed by researchers whose field observations are extensive enough to be treated as reliable. Certain Pokémon evolve only at specific phases of the lunar cycle. Others modify their behavior, become more active or less active, alter their ranges or their feeding habits in response to what the moon is doing on any given night. What the tradition of the coastal offering represents is a community's accumulated response to the pattern of this behavior, translated over many generations from observation to practice, without retaining the observational record that would allow someone arriving new to understand the logic. The tradition has become its own kind of knowledge, stored in behavior rather than in documentation, requiring participation to access in a way that written knowledge does not require. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at which Pokémon species have historically been associated with lunar influence in the traditions of the regions where the influence is most extensively documented. The overlap between these traditionally recognized species and the species that formal research has subsequently confirmed as lunar responsive is high enough to suggest that the traditional knowledge was encoding accurate observations about the world, that the communities maintaining these practices were preserving real information in a form that their descendants could continue to act on even without understanding the mechanism being acted on. The gap between traditional knowledge and formal research in the Pokémon world is a gap that the games generally navigate around rather than through, presenting the formal research tradition as primary without entirely discrediting the traditional knowledge that preceded and sometimes exceeded it. The coastal offering practice exists in this gap, a tradition that may be preserving accurate information about Pokémon behavior in a form that the formal research tradition has not yet encoded. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the lunar traditions of the Alolan coast are a reminder that the Pokémon world contains multiple ways of knowing the same things, and that the relationships between those ways of knowing are not simply a matter of the old being replaced by the new. The formal research tradition has produced knowledge that traditional practices did not have. The traditional practices have preserved knowledge that the formal research tradition has not yet recovered. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and the mystery of the coastal offering is in part the mystery of which category this particular tradition falls into. There is a researcher in the Pokémon world who has spent more time studying a single Pokémon than most researchers spend on entire families of species. Oak, elm, birch, rowan, juniper, the professors named for trees who stand at the beginning of each new region's story, are generalists whose knowledge extends across all Pokémon rather than deepening around any particular one. But in the background of the research tradition, there are figures whose work is narrower and whose understanding of the specific creatures they study is correspondingly deeper. The researcher who has spent decades studying the Gengar line operates at the intersection of biology, neuroscience, and what the research community calls parapsychology, a term that in the Pokémon world refers not to the study of dubious claims, but to the well-documented phenomenon of psychic-type influence and its intersection with the behavioral and experiential lives of ghost-type Pokémon. The two types overlap in ways that no other type pairing does, and the researcher studying this overlap has produced a body of work that the wider community has not entirely known what to do with. What the research suggests is that ghost-type Pokémon interact with human consciousness through mechanisms that the established understanding of Pokémon type classification does not fully account for. The cold that people report feeling in the presence of certain ghost types is not simply atmospheric. The specific quality of unease associated with being watched by a Gengar is not simply a predator response triggered by eye contact with a large nocturnal creature. These experiences, documented consistently enough to be treated as reliable, point to an influence that operates through channels the current research vocabulary cannot describe precisely. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the Pokédex entries describing ghost-type interactions with sleep and dreams. Multiple ghost types are described as entering the space of sleep and dreams in ways that imply an access to human consciousness that should not be biologically possible given the physical separation between a sleeping human and a ghost Pokémon in the same space. The mechanism is not explained. The access is simply documented, as if the Pokédex considers the fact of the access more important than the explanation of how it works. The relationship between ghost types and the human experience of sleep is one that the research tradition has circled without landing on, producing studies that document effects without proposing mechanisms, and that acknowledge the category of phenomenon being studied without integrating it into the broader framework of Pokémon biology. The researcher who has spent decades on the Gengar line has produced more documentation than anyone else of exactly this category of interaction, and the documentation has not yet generated the theoretical framework that would allow the research community to know what to do with it. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the intersection of ghost types and human consciousness is one of the Pokemon world's most unresolved research areas, a field where the evidence is ample and consistent, and the theoretical framework for understanding what the evidence means is essentially absent. The researcher studying it has spent decades working at the edge of what the available vocabulary can describe, documenting carefully and making claims cautiously, aware that what they are studying requires tools that have not yet been built. The Pokemon world has a small number of cases in which the same individual Pokemon has been encountered by multiple trainers across generations, beings whose lifespans are long enough that their personal history extends across timelines that would include many human lifetimes. Lapras was encountered in the Kanto games, and the same Lapras appeared in the Alolan Seas generations later, a continuity the games note without dwelling on. The red Gyarados of the Johto region was created by specific human interference in Pokemon development, and exists as a documented individual rather than a species occurrence. These specific individuals have histories that the Pokemon world does not normally track. What the existence of these long-lived documented individuals implies about the interior life of Pokemon is something the games have touched on indirectly through the experiences of trainers who encounter them and through the behavioral observations recorded by researchers who have spent time in the locations where these individuals are known to remain. A Pokemon that has lived for many human generations has accumulated experience in a way that younger specimens of its species have not. And the question of how that accumulated experience is organized, whether it functions as memory in the human sense or as something more diffuse, is one that the research tradition has not addressed directly. The specific Lapras encountered in Alola carries within its behavioral repertoire evidence of experiences that predate the generation of researchers studying it. Responses to specific environmental conditions and human interactions that appear to have been shaped by events the researchers cannot access through direct observation. The Lapras has been where the researchers cannot follow, and what it brought back from those places is expressed in behavior without ever being translatable into documentation. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at what trainers report after reaching the ends of these difficult routes and finding the places they were designed to find. The experience is not uniformly what was expected. The legendary Pokemon found at the end of the long climb is often described in terms that suggest the encounter was more than a mechanical event, that the specific quality of the space and the specific difficulty of the journey contributed something to the experience that a less effortful encounter would not have contained. The encounter has a quality that the number of steps required to reach it helped create. Whether the legendary Pokemon encountered at these destinations experienced the encounter differently because of the difficulty the trainer went through to reach them is not a question the games address. But the consistent design choice to place the most significant encounters at the ends of the most demanding routes implies something about what both the journey and the encounter are for. The cave at the end of the mountain passage is more itself because of everything required to reach it. The Pokemon found there is more fully what it is because it has not been made easy to approach. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, Terminus Cave is a mystery not about what it contains, but about what the act of reaching it means. The cave's name implies an ending, a place where the route stops. But in the Pokemon world, the places where routes stop are often the places where the most important things begin. The terminus is not the end of the journey. It is the place where the journey becomes something else, something that the journey itself could not have been without the cave at its conclusion. There is a Pokemon in the Pokemon world that exists specifically because someone tried to clone the most genetically complete organism in existence. Mewtwo was discussed earlier, but the shadow it casts forward extends further than any single conversation can follow, into questions about what the existence of a successfully engineered Pokemon means for the categories the world uses to understand the relationship between natural and artificial, between made and born. The Pokemon world has several beings whose origin is creation rather than birth or evolution in the biological sense. Golett and Gulyurk were molded from clay and animated by ancient civilizations. Type: Null and Silvally were engineered by researchers with specific objectives. Mewtwo was cloned from genetic material with enhancements designed to produce specific outcomes. These beings all entered the world through acts of deliberate making rather than through the processes that produce most Pokémon. And the question of whether they are therefore different in kind from naturally occurring Pokémon is one the world has engaged with in specific contexts, without resolving as a general principle. The games that feature these created beings tend to treat the question of their status as Pokémon as resolved, including them in the Pokédex and the type classification system, and the battle mechanics without making their origin a disqualifying factor. But the narrative treatment of their origin stories, the weight given to the circumstances of their creation, and the effect of those circumstances on their experience of themselves, suggests that the games understand creation to be a different kind of origin than birth, carrying with it a set of questions and challenges that birth does not. As we drift a little deeper into this final topic, the light is perhaps the simplest answer to the question of what the Pokémon world's mysteries are for. They are not puzzles to be solved. They are the places where the world becomes luminous, where the ordinary path opens onto something that the map did not show and that the traveler could not have anticipated. Every mystery in this world is, in its own way, a moment of that light, a place where the boundary became permeable, a moment where something passed through, and the world, as it always has, simply marked the moment and let it mean what it means. There is also the question of the trainers who never come back. The Pokemon world is full of roots and caves and seas and mountains, and the evidence in the games suggests that the world is large enough and complex enough, and in certain places serious enough that not every journey that began has been completed. The missing trainers are not discussed directly in any game, but their absence is legible in small details, in the families in the towns who watch the routes with a particular quality of attention, in the abandoned campsites found at unexpected distances from the nearest city, in the researchers who went to study something and whose subsequent publications are not in any archive. These absences are not presented as tragic in the games, which maintain their tone of adventure and possibility across even the most unsettling locations. But they are there, quiet negative spaces in the texture of the world. Evidence of a world that does not simply contain mysteries for the safe contemplation of travelers who will return home afterward, but that is genuinely consequential, that takes from some of those who engage with it something they do not get back. What the missing trainers represent in the mythology of the Pokemon world is the cost side of the ledger, the thing the game's adventure framing tends to keep in the background. The legendary Pokemon are magnificent, and the mysteries are fascinating, and the routes are beautiful. And all of this is true, but the beauty is not safe in the way that beauty is sometimes assumed to be. The world is large enough and serious enough that moving through it requires something of those who move through it, and not all of those who required something were given back what they offered. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at how the communities near the most dangerous locations have developed their own traditions around the question of what those who enter might face. The people who live near the deep caves and the ancient ruins, and the routes adjacent to spaces where legendary Pokemon are known to be present, tend to have traditions that acknowledge this cost explicitly, maintaining practices that recognize the possibility of not returning rather than simply assuming that all journeys end in homecoming. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the missing trainers are the Pokemon world's most honest accounting of what it means to take the world's mysteries seriously, to go where the questions are, to enter the spaces where the boundaries are thinnest, to seek the encounters that the legend describes and the map marks but that the legend and the map cannot fully prepare for, is to accept a risk that the adventure framing does not always name. The light at the moments of crossing marks something real. The darkness on the other side of that light is also real, and the world holds both with the same patient equanimity it brings to everything it contains. The mysteries rest here now, exactly where they have always rested, and the world that holds them is richer for the holding, more alive for the questions than it would ever be for the answers. Every unanswered question in the Pokemon world is a space kept open, a room whose door has not been closed, a lake that has not been fully sounded. The depth of those spaces is part of what makes the world worth returning to, year after year, game after game, night after night. The lakes will stay cold, and the halls will stay sealed, and the walls of the ruins will continue to speak in a language that sits just at the edge of understanding. And that is not a failure of the world. It is the world being generous, offering to those who are willing to sit quietly in it the particular pleasure of a question that is worth having. Tonight, those questions rest with you, held lightly, carried gently, present in the way that only the best mysteries are present, not demanding anything, simply being there, in the quiet, dark, patient, and unhurried, waiting for whatever comes next, in the way that all good questions wait, with a kind of settled stillness that does not require resolution to feel complete. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet mysteries, there is another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you. The world of Pokémon will be here in the morning, holding all of its questions exactly as you left them.